Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. My name is Jacob, but everyone calls me Jake. I never really liked that nickname, much too casual, too soft for someone like me. I value my personal space, don't like being touched, and generally prefer people to keep their distance from my inner world. Maybe that's why Portland, with its perpetual rain and the reserved nature of its residents, seemed like the perfect place to study. I enrolled in the archaeology program, always dreaming of digging into the past and finding answers there. Or maybe I was just running from the present. I found my room through an online listing, cheap, downtown, perfect for a student. Classic choice. An old Victorian house, just what I needed to immerse myself in the city's atmosphere. The photos were mediocre, dim and grainy, showing typical old-fashioned furniture, but the price outweighed all doubts. Plus, the location was excellent walking distance to the university. The landlady, Mrs. Henderson, sounded like a sweet old woman over the phone. Her voice was smooth, enveloping, you know the type. When I arrived to see the room, she met me right at the front door, short, plump, with a bun of gray hair at the back of her head and surprisingly lively, sharp eyes. "Oh, Jacob, is that you? I've been waiting for you," she cooed, and then, without any transition, grabbed my hand. Her fingers, dry and cool, squeezed my palm with unexpected strength. "Come on, I'll show you everything." I didn't like this immediately. I wasn't fond of being touched by strangers or by people I knew either, if I'm being honest. But I kept quiet, chalked it up to elderly spontaneity. Didn't want to seem rude from the start. The entrance hall greeted us with twilight and the smell of old wood, dust, and something else subtly disturbing, like decaying leaves. There was no elevator, of course. As we climbed to the third floor, Mrs. Henderson kept talking, telling me about the house, about former tenants, and how wonderful it was to live here. I mostly looked around high ceilings with remnants of crown molding, dim bulbs in dusty fixtures, long hallways stretching into the unknown. From somewhere came muffled coughing and quiet meowing. Atmospheric, I'll give it that. Maybe too atmospheric. The apartment turned out to be a typical old boarding house, enormous, like a cave. The main hallway, dimly lit by a single bulb somewhere in the middle, stretched in both directions as if inviting you to get lost. Doors, 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 all different, covered with vinyl of varying degrees of wear. Creaky floorboards underfoot. The air was stale, heavy. "Here you go, Jacob." Mrs. Henderson opened one of the doors. "This will be your room." The room was small, elongated, with one tall window facing an equally gloomy courtyard. An old writing desk by the window, a sagging couch, a wardrobe with peeling lacquer, and a bookshelf crammed with ancient volumes in tattered bindings. The wallpaper, once apparently light-colored, had yellowed and was peeling in places, revealing layers of previous eras. But overall, it was livable. Most importantly, it was my own roof over my head, and the price didn't bite. "Well, how do you like it?" Mrs. Henderson stood nearby, too close. I could feel her breath on my neck. "It's fine," I replied, trying to maintain a neutral expression. "Wonderful," she put her hand on my shoulder again, squeezing slightly. We'll live like family. I'll do your laundry and cook for you if needed. Don't hesitate to ask." Her care was already getting on my nerves. I tried to politely free myself. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'll manage on my own. I'm used to it." "Well, as you wish, as you wish." She pursed her lips, but immediately smiled again. "Then make yourself at home. I'll help you bring in your things." I tactfully declined help with my things too. I only had one bag, not that heavy. When I was finally alone in my new room, the first thing I did was approach the window. The courtyard well made a depressing impression: gray, shabby walls, countless windows, most of which were dark or covered with some rags. The silence was almost absolute, only water dripping from somewhere above. I sighed. Well, it's not all that bad. At least it's downtown and quiet, perfect for studying. I unpacked my things, arranged books on the shelf, trying to give the room at least some lived-in appearance. I tried to open the window latch. It gave way with difficulty, squeaking. A stream of damp, cold air rushed into the room, mixed with that same strange smell of rotting leaves and something else, like stagnant water. The first few days passed relatively peacefully. I gradually settled in, got used to the new schedule at the university and the peculiarities of boarding house life. The other tenants turned out to be surprisingly quiet and, at first glance, quite friendly. In the kitchen, I occasionally crossed paths with Tyler, a guy about 30 years old who, as he said, was a freelance programmer. He was taciturn, always wearing headphones, glued to his laptop. He'd say hello, nod, and then back to his screen. This suited me more than fine. Another neighbor was Mrs. Wilson, a talkative old lady, the complete opposite of Tyler. She was well over 70, moved in small steps, leaning on a cane, and loved telling stories about her youth. She had several cats, 3 or 4, I never figured out exactly. Fluffy, multicolored, they constantly rubbed against her legs, or slept on all available surfaces. The cats, by the way, behaved strangely. They fawned over Mrs. Wilson, but carefully avoided the rest of the tenants, including me, and sometimes even hissed from under the couch in the kitchen. Mrs. Wilson just waved it off. "Oh, don't pay attention. They're wild, don't like people." The last neighbor was Emma, a student like me, but from a different department, literature, I think. A pretty girl with a shock of red hair and freckles. She rarely appeared in the kitchen, usually in the evenings, quickly cooking something simple and disappearing into her room. We exchanged a few phrases about professors and studies a couple of times. An ordinary girl, nothing special. Mrs. Henderson continued her policy of care. Every time she met me in the hallway or kitchen, she found a reason to touch me. Sometimes she'd adjust my shirt collar, which was already lying perfectly. Sometimes she'd brush off a non-existent speck from my shoulder, or simply take my hand, asking how my day went. Her touches were light, fleeting, but they made my skin crawl. I tried to keep my distance from her, but it wasn't always possible in the cramped space of the boarding house. "Jacob, you look so pale today," she'd say caringly, looking into my eyes and placing her cool palm on my forehead. "Are you feeling sick? I have some tea with raspberry jam, such wonderful jam, my own harvest." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, everything's fine." I'd politely remove her hand. "Just didn't sleep well." I attributed her behavior to loneliness and an elderly person's need to care for someone. Well, I couldn't kick her out for this, especially since she was really helpful otherwise, always telling me where things were in the common kitchen. keeping the shared spaces clean, though this cleanliness was quite relative. Gradually, I began to notice small oddities that at first seemed like simple peculiarities of this old house and its inhabitants. For example, the food. Sometimes Mrs. Henderson, despite my refusals, still managed to slip me something tasty. A pastry, a pancake, or a plate of soup. Eat up, Jacob, homemade food. You can't survive long on junk food, she'd say. This food had some strange, barely perceptible aftertaste, Swedish herbal, not unpleasant, but unusual. After such meals, I usually felt drowsy, a bit drained. I tried to eat her treats as rarely as possible, saying I'd eaten at the cafeteria or had my own groceries. One evening, I was sitting in my room preparing for a seminar. Outside, the wind was howling. Rain was pattering against the glass. The room was uncomfortable despite the old oil heater I'd dragged from the basement. It seemed that the wall adjoining the hallway was particularly cold. I went closer and noticed that in one place the wallpaper had come unstuck slightly, forming an ugly bubble. Absent-mindedly, I picked at it with my fingernail. The wallpaper gave way easily, peeling off in a whole piece and revealing a dark patch of plaster underneath and something else. Looking closer, I saw a small piece of paper folded several times, stuffed into a crack between the plaster and lath. My heart started beating faster for some reason. I carefully extracted the note. The paper was old, yellowed, the ink faded. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. There were only a few words written in an uneven, hurried handwriting. She always watches. I went cold. Who is she? Who watches? Mrs. Henderson. But why would she spy, and why was the note hidden as if it were some terrible secret? I looked around, though I knew I was alone in the room. The feeling of anxiety, which had been dormant somewhere on the periphery of my consciousness, began to slowly awaken. I crumpled the note and was about to throw it away, but then changed my mind and shoved it into the desk drawer under old notes. Maybe it was just someone's stupid joke or remnants of some old game by previous tenants. The house was old. Who knows who had lived here? That night I had a nightmare. Long dark hallways like in our boarding house, only even more confusing and endless. I was running through them, gasping, and someone was chasing me. I couldn't see the pursuer, but felt their icy breath behind my back and constantly heard whispers. Watches, always watches. I woke up in a cold sweat. The sun hadn't risen yet. Outside it was gray and damp. My first thought was to check the note. It was in its place, so it wasn't a dream. In recent days, I'd become more attentive, wary, listening to every rustle in the apartment, watching the neighbors. But they behaved as usual. Tyler silently coded. Mrs. Wilson cooed with her cats and told stories. Emma flitted like a shadow. Mrs. Henderson still tried to take care of me, but I learned to dodge her touches more decisively. One day, while cleaning my room, I decided to move the old heavy dresser standing in the corner, just to sweep out the dust that had accumulated underneath. The dresser gave way with difficulty, creaking across the floor. Underneath, in a layer of ancient dust, I saw something else. A small child's shoe, blackened with age, just one. And next to it another scrap of paper, as yellowed as the first. On it was scrawled just one word: cold. A shiver ran through me. A child's shoe here. Had children gone missing, or was it just a lost item? But the note, it was clearly left, not just randomly. I began examining the room more thoroughly, tapping walls, looking under loose baseboards. My searches were successful. Behind a loose windowsill board, I found another note. This one was written in pencil, almost erased, but I could make it out. Don't trust them. Don't trust whom? The neighbors, Mrs. Henderson. My head was spinning. What the hell was going on here? I felt fear beginning to penetrate deeper, poisoning my thoughts, making me suspect everyone. I tried to talk to Emma, catching her in the kitchen when she was making coffee. Hey Emma, listen, have you been living here long? She started as if I'd caught her off guard. Hi Jake. Yeah, about 6 months, I guess. Why? Just wondering, haven't you noticed anything strange about the apartment? I mean. Emma sipped her coffee, looked at me somewhat probingly. Strange like what? The creaky floorboards. Well, yeah, the house is old. Or are Mrs. Wilson's cats bothering you? They can be annoying. No, not the cats. I hesitated. How could I explain to her about the notes, about this oppressive feeling, without making myself look like a paranoid? Just the atmosphere is kind of heavy. Emma shrugged. I don't know, Jake. Seems like a normal boarding house to me. Everyone's a bit eccentric, but it's livable. You're probably just not used to it yet. Portland in general is a specific city, takes time to adjust. Her answer didn't satisfy me. She spoke too calmly, too matter-of-factly, as if she knew in advance what I'd ask. Or was this just my imagination? I decided to talk to Tyler. This was harder. He was almost always wearing headphones and didn't like being distracted. But I still gathered courage and knocked on his half-open door. Tyler, can I have a word? He took off his headphones, looked at me with an absent gaze. What? I wanted to ask, you've been here a while too. Don't you think there's something not right about this apartment? Well. Tyler silently looked at me for several seconds, then slowly said, Not right. Everything here is as it should be. Don't look for problems where there aren't any. And he put his headphones back on, making it clear the conversation was over. His words, his calmness, it was all somehow wrong, artificial. As it should be, what did that mean? I was left alone with my fears and fragments of other people's warnings. The room that had initially seemed old and a bit uncomfortable now appeared to me as a trap. The walls pressed in, shadows in the corners seemed alive, and the creaking floorboards in the hallway made me flinch. I began sleeping poorly, constantly listening to the night sounds of the apartment. Sometimes it seemed to me that someone was standing behind the door and listening. Sometimes I heard quiet whispers but couldn't make out the words. Mrs. Henderson, seeing my condition, became even more intrusive. Jacob, what's wrong with you? You're completely worn out. Here, I baked you some pastries with cabbage, your favorites. I looked at the plate of golden pastries and felt nausea rising to my throat. That sweetish herbal smell now seemed sinister to me. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, I'm not hungry. How can you not be hungry? Your skin and bones, look at yourself in the mirror. I looked from the old, dim mirror in the hallway. An unfamiliar pale young man with dark circles under his eyes stared back at me. She was right, I really looked terrible. But eating her pastries? No way. I began locking myself in my room more often, only coming out when absolutely necessary to go to university, to the store for groceries. I tried to interact with neighbors as little as possible. The illusion of well-being, if it had existed in the first days, finally dissipated, leaving behind sticky, cold fear. Something was wrong with this apartment, with these people. I felt that something was slowly creeping up on me. Time in this apartment flowed differently, viscous and slow, like swamp sludge. Days merged into a gray, damp mass almost indistinguishable from Portland's twilight outside the window. My health deteriorated daily. A monstrous weakness appeared, apathy toward everything. In the morning, it was unbearably hard to force myself to get up from the couch. My legs felt like lead, my head stuffed with cotton. Studies took a back seat, if not third. What seminars and lectures when all your strength goes just to exist? Regular food that I bought at the store began to disgust me. Bread seemed like cardboard, sausage like soap. Even my formerly favorite instant noodles made me nauseous just looking at them. I almost stopped eating, losing weight visibly. My skin became unhealthily pale and almost transparent, constantly cold to the touch, even when the room was warm from the heater. Sometimes I'd look at my hands for a long time, thin, with protruding veins. They seemed foreign, but my hearing and smell sharpened. Earlier, I would have been happy about this, but now these superabilities only intensified my anxiety. I heard every rustle in the apartment, how the floorboards creaked under someone's steps at the other end of the hallway, how Tyler quietly breathed behind the wall, how pages rustled in Emma's room, how Mrs. Wilson muttered something to her cats. Sometimes at night, sounds reached me from Mrs. Henderson's room, either quiet crying or some monotonous mumbling resembling prayer. Smells also became unbearably sharp. I felt the stale dust in every corner, the heavy scent of old wood, dampness coming from the walls, and that omnipresent, barely perceptible Swedish herbal aroma that I now associated exclusively with Mrs. Henderson and her treats. It emanated from her clothes, from her room. Sometimes it seemed to me that the apartment walls themselves were saturated with it. And there was another smell I couldn't identify, but that made me especially uneasy, something like the smell of a damp basement, mold, and something subtly metallic, like old blood. This smell was particularly strong near the door to the landlady's room. The neighbors deserve a separate story. At first, I attributed their oddities to my growing paranoia, but the more I observed, the stronger my conviction grew that something was wrong with them. I began to notice that they moved somehow too smoothly, almost synchronously, especially in household matters. In the kitchen, for example, Tyler and Emma could simultaneously reach for the salt shaker, their hands moving at the same speed, stopping centimeters from each other. And then one of them would yield as if by an invisible command. Or when I said something, all three, Tyler, Emma, and Mrs. Wilson, if she was nearby, would turn their heads toward me simultaneously, like marionettes. Their smiles, God, those smiles. They smiled often, especially when addressing me or Mrs. Henderson, but these smiles were somehow pasted on. Their lips stretched, baring teeth, but their eyes remained cold, empty, expressionless, like dolls. These smiles sent chills down my spine. They constantly cooked something in the kitchen, brought pots and plates, sometimes even offered them to me. Jacob, try this soup, it turned out so delicious. Or here, I baked a pie, help yourself. But I never saw them actually eat this food in front of me. They could put a plate in front of themselves, poke at it with a fork, but didn't eat a single bite. Then, when I turned away or left the kitchen, the food disappeared. Once I accidentally saw Emma pouring an almost full plate of soup into the toilet, quickly looking around. When she noticed my gaze, she became unnaturally flustered, and said the soup was too salty. And the mirror. In the long hallway opposite the bathroom door hung an old, huge mirror in a tarnished frame. It was cloudy, covered with some spots, but still reflected the dim light of the bulb and people passing by. Once I was standing at the sink and Tyler walked past. I casually glanced in the mirror and didn't see his reflection. That is, I saw the hallway, the opposite wall, but Tyler wasn't in the mirror. I decided I was mistaken, wrong angle, or the light fell that way. But then I began watching specifically. And Emma and Mrs. Wilson, and even Mrs. Henderson herself, none of them reflected in that old mirror. They passed by, and the mirror surface remained empty, as if they were ghosts. I, however, reflected quite clearly. This fact finally convinced me that I wasn't going crazy, that something really sinister was happening here. Mrs. Wilson's cats had previously just avoided me, sometimes hissed, but lately their behavior had changed. They still shunned Tyler, Emma, and Mrs. Henderson, hiding under the couch or wardrobe when those three passed by, but they began reaching out to me. Once I was sitting in the kitchen, immersed in my gloomy thoughts, when one of the cats, the boldest, black and white with green eyes, approached me and rubbed against my leg. I absent-mindedly petted it. It purred and even let me pick it up. Mrs. Wilson, seeing this, made some strange sound. "Oh, Whiskers came to you. That's rare. Means you're one of us, a real person." What did she mean by that? Maybe the cat sensed that I was still clean, not like the others. Or conversely, that I was already beginning to change, becoming one of them. I found several more notes. One under a piece of linoleum that had come loose in the kitchen when I accidentally dropped a spoon. "They drink life." Another shoved behind a pipe in the toilet. "Run while you can, or you'll become like them." The third, the most frightening, I found in one of the old books on my shelf. It was tucked between pages like a bookmark, short, just 2 words written in a trembling hand. "I'm hungry," and a signature. "Former tenant of room number 7, my room." Attempts to talk to someone outside failed. I called my parents, tried to hint that I was feeling bad here, that I wanted to move. My mother started lamenting that I just wasn't used to independent life, that I needed to be patient. My father grumbled that I had chosen this city and this apartment myself, so there was no point complaining now. I was afraid to tell friends anything at all, they'd laugh. Say I was paranoid from studying and lack of sleep. I was alone with my horror, trapped in this cursed apartment with creatures that only pretended to be people. I began to suspect that the apartment wasn't just an old house. It was something alive, sinister. It fed on fear, despair, emotions of tenants accumulated here over decades. The walls seemed to absorb emotions and then ooze them back, creating this oppressive, crushing atmosphere. Sometimes it seemed to me that I heard a quiet sigh coming from the walls themselves, or felt the floor under my feet barely noticeably vibrating, as if a huge black heart was beating beneath it. My suspicions grew into animal terror. I couldn't stay here anymore. I needed to run immediately. To hell with studies, with money paid for the room. The main thing was to get out of here, before I finally turned into the same pale, cold, and eternally hungry tenant as the one who left a note in the book. I began secretly packing my things, putting the most necessary items in my bag. Documents, some clothes, laptop. I did this at night when everything in the apartment was quiet, though I wasn't sure they actually slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle behind the door made me freeze, and listen. When it seemed to me that everyone was asleep, I decided to act. The bag was packed, stuffed not too heavily so as not to attract attention. I quietly dressed, trying not to make noise. My heart was pounding in my chest, so hard it seemed its beating could be heard throughout the apartment. I cracked open my room door and peered into the hallway. Darkness, silence. Only the dim bulb somewhere in the middle of the corridor cast flickering shadows. On tiptoes, trying not to step on the most creaky floorboards, I moved toward the front door. Each step was difficult. The corridor seemed endless. There it was, the saving door. I reached for the latch. "Jacob, where are you going so late?" Mrs. Henderson's voice sounded right behind my back, soft, enveloping, but with some new, unfamiliar intonation. I froze, chilled with horror. Slowly, I turned around. All of them stood in the corridor. Mrs. Henderson in front, her face in the twilight seeming molded from wax, her eyes burning with an evil fire. Behind her were Tyler, Emma, and Mrs. Wilson. Their usual friendliness had vanished without a trace. Those same doll-like smiles were frozen on their faces, making my blood run cold. Mrs. Wilson's cat sat at her feet, their eyes glowing green in the darkness, and they growled quietly, gutturally, looking at me. "We were just about to have tea," Mrs. Henderson continued in her honeyed voice. "Join us, Jacob. I made such wonderful pastries today, you'll lick your fingers with your favorite filling." I looked at them and words stuck in my throat. There was nowhere to run. They stood in a solid wall, blocking the exit. My hand still lay on the door latch, but I understood it was useless. "I just wanted to get some fresh air," I mumbled, understanding the absurdity of my words. "Fresh air? At night? With a bag?" Emma smirked. Her voice had also changed, become lower with metallic notes. "Don't make things up, Jake. We understand everything." Tyler stepped forward. He was still as silent as before, but in his empty eyes I saw something predatory, hungry. "Running is pointless," Mrs. Henderson said calmly, almost matter-of-factly. She took a step toward me, extended her dry, cold hand, and placed it on my shoulder. This time her grip was iron. "You're already one of us, Jacob, almost one of us." These words echoed in my head. I looked at my hands, pale, cold. I remembered the strange hunger that had been tormenting me lately, the revulsion toward ordinary food. I remembered the notes. "They drink life. You'll become like them. I'm hungry." "What are you?" I whispered, feeling despair wash over me like an icy wave. "We're family," Mrs. Henderson smiled, and there was nothing human in that smile. "A big, friendly family. And we're always glad to have new members, especially young ones, full of life like you." She brought her face close to mine. I felt that same sweetish herbal smell, but now it was mixed with something else, the smell of decay, damp earth. Her eyes seemed to look straight into my soul. "The process has already gone too far, dear," she whispered. "From the very first day, from my first touch, from the first spoonful of my treats, you're now connected to us, connected to this house." The entire boarding house was a family of inhuman creatures. For centuries, they had been luring young, lonely people here, feeding on their life energy, their youth, their fears. They skillfully played out a performance of normal life for each new victim, lulling vigilance, tightening their nets. Tyler, Emma, Mrs. Wilson, they too had once been like me, and now they were part of this nightmare. I looked at them, at their unblinking eyes, at their frozen smiles, and understood it was true. It was too late to run. I was trapped, and this trap had snapped shut. The realization that I was trapped and the transformation process was apparently irreversible crashed down on me with its monstrous weight. In the first second, I wanted to simply scream, huddle in a corner like a frightened animal. The despair was so thick, so all-consuming, it seemed I could suffocate. But then, from the very depths of my being, something else began to rise. Rage. Blind, living rage and desperate desire to live. Not the life they were offering me, but my own. I looked at Mrs. Henderson. She still held me by the shoulder, her fingers digging into my skin like claws. Triumphant lights danced in her eyes. She was the source, the queen of this cursed hive, I thought. If I destroy her, maybe there's a chance to at least try to die fighting, rather than turn into an obedient puppet, sucking life from others. No, I burst out. I jerked sharply, trying to throw off her hand. She didn't expect such resistance. Her grip weakened for a moment, and I took advantage of it. I pushed her so hard that she staggered and stepped back. Tyler and Emma immediately lunged toward me, their faces twisted with malice. Mrs. Wilson hissed something, and her cats, as if on command, with guttural growling, rushed under my feet, trying to sink their claws into my ankles. A mad, chaotic fight began. I fought off the cats, dodged Tyler and Emma's grasping hands. They were surprisingly strong and fast, but their movements still remained somewhat mechanical, devoid of human flexibility. I understood that I couldn't hold out long. There were too many of them, and I was weakened by weeks of hunger and fear. I needed a weapon, anything. My gaze darted around the corridor. A coat rack with coats, an old cabinet with a phone, the kitchen. There should be knives there, but I still had to get to the kitchen. Mrs. Henderson, recovering from my push, moved toward me again. Her face was contorted with rage. "Foolish boy," she hissed. "You won't leave anyway, you'll be ours." She stretched her hands toward me. Her nails, it seemed to me, had lengthened and sharpened, turning into claws. I jumped aside, barely dodging, and then my gaze fell on what stood on the common cabinet near the kitchen entrance. An old cast-iron flat iron, the kind they used to heat on stoves. Heavy, massive. It served here apparently as some kind of paperweight for utility bills, or just stood as a decorative element. Now it seemed like the most beautiful object in the world. Without thinking, I rushed to the cabinet, grabbed the iron. It was incredibly heavy, cold. Tyler tried to intercept me, but I, turning around, struck him with all my might with the iron on his outstretched arm. There was a strange, dry crack, like a broken, dry branch. Tyler howled in a high, inhuman voice and recoiled, pressing his damaged arm to his chest. From under his fingers oozed not blood, but some dark, thick liquid resembling tar. Emma shrieked and jumped back. Mrs. Wilson froze, and her cats also fell silent, looking at me with fear. For a moment, absolute silence reigned in the corridor. I used this respite. The main target was Mrs. Henderson. She stood by the wall, her eyes burning with hatred. She was whispering something, some strange, guttural words that made my hair stand on end. I felt a wave of icy cold emanating from her. "You wouldn't dare," she growled when I stepped toward her, gripping the iron with both hands. "Oh yes, I would," I shouted, not recognizing my own voice. I raised the iron, and with all my strength, putting all my rage, all my despair into the blow, brought the cast iron weight down on her head. There was a dull, nauseating sound. Something crunched. Mrs. Henderson didn't even cry out. Her eyes widened, Surprise flashed in them for a moment, then they glazed over. She began to slowly sink to the floor, as if cut down. Dark, viscous liquid sprayed from her cracked skull, the same as from Tyler. The moment she fell, the other neighbors froze. Tyler, Emma, Mrs. Wilson, they stood like statues, their faces frozen in grimaces of horror and pain. Then they began to change. It was a horrible sight. First, their bodies were covered with some haze. Then they began to blur, lose their outlines. Tyler started crumbling, turning into a pile of gray ash that was immediately picked up by a draft from the slightly open kitchen window. Emma seemed to dissolve like a shadow at dawn, leaving behind only a barely noticeable dark stain on the floor. Mrs. Wilson simply vanished, evaporated, and her cats with pitiful meows scattered in different directions, and also dissolved in the air as if they had never existed. In a few seconds, I was alone in the corridor. Alone, if you don't count Mrs. Henderson's body sprawled on the floor, or what remained of her, and a pile of ash where Tyler had just stood. My bag with things lay lonely by the front door. In the apartment, frightening, oppressive silence reigned, the kind that exists only in cemeteries or abandoned houses. I stood, breathing heavily, still clutching the heavy cast iron in my hand. My hands were shaking, my legs were giving way. I looked at my hands. The skin had become even paler, almost porcelain. The nails, it seemed to me, had really become longer and sharper. I raised my hand to my face. A subtle, barely perceptible coolness emanated from the skin. And then I felt it, the hunger. That same hunger that had been tormenting me the last few days, but now it was different, stronger, sharper, almost unbearable. And this was no longer hunger for ordinary food. This was a thirst for something else, something living. I sank to the floor, unable to stand any longer. Killing Mrs. Henderson hadn't stopped the transformation. Maybe it slowed it down, or conversely, accelerated it, making me the heir. I didn't know. I only knew one thing. I had become like them, or almost like them. I sat on the floor in the empty, echoing corridor among the remains of my former neighbors. And I was shaking, not from fear, but from hunger, and from the horror of realizing what I had become. Several days passed. I don't remember exactly how many. Maybe 3, maybe 5. I didn't leave the apartment. Why would I? The outside world had ceased to exist for me. I wandered through the empty rooms like a ghost. Tyler's room, Emma's room, Mrs. Wilson's room. They were all empty, faceless, as if their inhabitants had simply evaporated without leaving any traces, except barely noticeable patches of dust. Mrs. Henderson's body also disappeared after a few hours after her death. It began to darken, shrivel, and then simply crumbled to dust, like the others. The apartment itself took care of cleaning up. The hunger grew stronger. It gnawed at me from inside, driving me crazy. I tried to eat ordinary food, bread, canned goods I found in the kitchen, but it seemed like ash to me, caused vomiting. I needed different food. Sometimes I caught myself standing at the window, looking at people scurrying below on the street. They seemed so alive, full of energy. My new, monstrous instinct told me that this was exactly what I needed. One morning, I woke up with a clear understanding of what I had to do. This understanding came not from reason, but from somewhere deep in my new, changed being. I approached my laptop, opened it. My fingers moved across the keyboard on their own. Room for rent in boarding house in downtown Portland. Affordable, quiet neighbors, preferably young person, student, male or female. I reread the listing. It sounded appealing, just like the one I had once fallen for myself. I clicked publish. Then I sat by the window and began to wait. The hunger subsided slightly, replaced by another feeling anticipation. I knew that soon someone would respond. Someone young, naive, looking for cheap housing in the big city. The cycle had to begin anew. I looked at my hands pale with long, sharpened nails. I was a monster, but I was hungry and the apartment was hungry. It had always been hungry. Somewhere deep in my soul, the old Jake still stirred that archaeology student who had come to Portland chasing a dream. He screamed in horror and disgust at what I had become, but his voice was so weak, so distant. It was almost drowned out by the rising, all-consuming hunger. The room, embraced by darkness, awaited its new victim, and I was its hospitable host. Comment below if you're currently renting apartments, especially if you're in Portland. That would be really something. I hope you're not renting one of these rooms or an apartment like this, because that would be absolutely terrifying. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did. Give it a thumbs up, and also, if you listened to it all the way to the end, leave a fire emoji so we know how many of us made it to the very end. We'll hear from each other, as always, in the next spine-chillingly interesting story. The grayness had seeped into everything, into the cracked sidewalks, into the boarded-up storefronts, into the very souls of Millbrook's residents. Once a thriving automotive town, Millbrook now limped along like a wounded animal, its factories shuttered, its downtown a graveyard of broken dreams and rust-stained buildings. The skeletal remains of the old Ford plant dominated the horizon like a monument to better times, while overhead, perpetual clouds seemed to trap the town in a dome of perpetual gloom. For 17-year-old Marcus, Tyler, and Rebecca, all seniors at Millbrook High, this grayness wasn't just background noise. It was a prison sentence. Slow suffocation in a town where dreams came to die, where the brightest future most kids could hope for was a job at the gas station or maybe, if they were really lucky, community college 40 miles away. Senior year dragged on like a broken clock, each day identical to the last. College applications sat half-finished on desks, not because these kids lacked ambition, but because ambition felt pointless when you couldn't even imagine a world beyond the rusted water towers and potholed streets of Millbrook. I'm so freaking bored I could scream, Tyler groaned, kicking an empty energy drink can across the cracked basketball court behind the school. The can rattled against the chain-link fence with a hollow, metallic clang. Tyler was all restless energy and wild ideas, tall and lanky, with perpetually messy brown hair and eyes that always seemed to be looking for the next thrill. He was the kind of kid who climbed water towers just to see if he could, who drove too fast on back roads just to feel alive. This place is like living in a freaking time loop. Same boring faces, same boring classes, same boring everything. Marcus barely looked up from his phone screen, his fingers dancing across the latest coding project he pulled up. Short and stocky with thick-rimmed glasses and an oversized hoodie that had seen better days, Marcus was Tyler's opposite in every way. Where Tyler craved action, Marcus found his adventures in lines of code and late-night gaming sessions. But even he couldn't escape the suffocating monotony of their small-town existence. Maybe if you actually did your homework instead of complaining about everything, you'd have less time to be bored, Marcus muttered, adjusting his glasses as lines of code reflected in the lenses. Oh, come on, Mark. Don't tell me you're not dying to get out of here too. This place is like quicksand for teenagers. Rebecca sat cross-legged on an old wooden picnic table, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, pencil moving in smooth, deliberate strokes. She was quiet and observant, with dark hair that always seemed to catch the light just right and gray eyes that noticed things other people missed. While her friends complained, she found beauty in the decay around them. But even she felt the weight of Millbrook's limitations pressing down on her shoulders. "I'm not bored," she said without looking up from her drawing. "There's always something interesting if you know how to look for it." "Yeah, well, some of us need a little more excitement than sketching broken windows and dead trees," Tyler shot back, though there was no real malice in his voice. "Senior year is supposed to be epic, you know. We're supposed to have stories to tell. Instead, we're just existing." Rebecca finally glanced up, studying Tyler's restless pacing with the same intensity she brought to her art. "Maybe you should try finding excitement that doesn't involve potentially getting us arrested." "Where's the fun in that?" Tyler grinned, but there was something hollow behind his smile. The truth was, they were all feeling it. The crushing weight of a future that seemed to stretch ahead of them like an endless gray highway leading nowhere special. Marcus suddenly straightened, his phone screen reflecting the excitement that had just sparked in his eyes behind his glasses. "Actually, guys, I might have found something. Something different." Both Tyler and Rebecca turned toward him, Tyler practically bouncing on his feet with sudden interest. "I was browsing some underground forums last night, you know, the kind you need special browsers to access. And I found this thing called Silent Hollow." Silent Hollow. Tyler was already moving closer, his attention completely captured. "Sounds mysterious. What is it?" Marcus scrolled through his phone, his expression growing more intrigued by the second. "It's some kind of alternate reality game, but not like the mainstream stuff you see on social media. This is invite only, completely anonymous. The organizer calls himself the Keeper, and nobody knows who he really is." "What kind of game?" Rebecca asked, closing her sketchbook and giving Marcus her full attention. "That's just it. Nobody really knows. The whole thing is shrouded in mystery. You have to solve this incredibly complex puzzle just to get invited. And even then, they only give you missions through private messages. But from what I could piece together from the few comments that don't get deleted immediately, it involves real-world challenges. You have to go to specific locations around town, complete tasks, find clues, record things." Tyler's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "Dude, that sounds incredible. Like a real-life treasure hunt or something. Are we talking about breaking into places? Urban exploration? Maybe. The posts I saw mentioned things like seeing the hidden truth of your city and uncovering what lies beneath the surface. There's supposed to be some kind of amazing final prize for anyone who makes it through all the challenges." Rebecca frowned, a chill running down her spine despite the warm afternoon. "Anonymous organizer, secretive challenges, mysterious locations. This sounds like how every true crime podcast starts." "Come on, Becca," Tyler groaned. "You always assume the worst. It's probably just some college kids who got creative with their programming skills. This could be exactly what we need. Something real, something that actually gets our blood pumping. Or something that gets us hurt, or worse." Rebecca's artist's intuition was practically screaming warnings at her. Think about it. Anonymous person on the dark web asking teenagers to go to isolated locations and complete unknown tasks. That's literally the setup for every horror movie ever made. But Marcus was already pulling up something on his screen, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Actually, I already solved the entry puzzle. It was this really complex cipher based on local history. The founding of Millbrook, the old mining operations, stuff like that. Pretty sophisticated, actually." Tyler practically lunged for the phone. "No way, you're already in." What did they say? Marcus tilted the screen so they could see a simple message in stark white text against a black background. Welcome to Silent Hollow, player 712. Your journey into truth begins now. Player 712, Tyler repeated, his voice filled with awe. That means there are hundreds of other people doing this. We're part of something huge. Or we're the 712th victim, Rebecca muttered. But even she couldn't deny the flutter of curiosity in her chest. The first challenge came through about an hour ago, Marcus continued, scrolling down to reveal a new message. Listen to this. Find the heart of forgotten dreams where laughter died. Leave the keeper's mark upon its stage. Wait for the next whisper when shadows grow long. Tyler was practically vibrating with excitement. That's awesome. Cryptic, mysterious, perfect. Any idea what it means? Marcus nodded, his programmer's mind having already started working on the puzzle. I think so. There are coordinates attached, and they point to the old Millbrook Mall. You know, the one that's been abandoned for like 5 years. The dead mall. Rebecca's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Tyler, that place gives me the creeps even in broad daylight. There are always weird people hanging around there. Exactly. Tyler was already mentally planning their expedition. This is perfect. A real adventure, finally. When do we go? Marcus checked his phone again, scrolling through the additional details. According to this, we have to go tonight. It says when shadows grow long, and there's a note that the challenge must be completed during the deep hours when silence reigns. So basically, we need to be there around midnight. Midnight at an abandoned mall, Rebecca repeated slowly. This keeps getting better and better. But Tyler was already pacing again, this time with purpose rather than frustration. This is exactly what we needed. Something that's ours, something that nobody else at school will ever experience. Finally have a story worth telling. Rebecca looked at both of her friends, seeing the excitement blazing in Tyler's eyes and the quiet determination in Marcus's face. She knew that no matter what she said, they were going to do this. And despite every instinct telling her to stay home, she also knew she couldn't let them go alone. Fine, she sighed, surprising both boys. But if this turns into a horror movie situation, I'm blaming both of you. Yes, Tyler pumped his fist in the air. This is going to be epic. Midnight at the old mall. Bring flashlights and your sense of adventure. That night, armed with 3 phones, a handful of flashlights, and enough nervous energy to power the town, they made their way to the Millbrook Mall. The massive structure loomed against the night sky like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, its empty parking lot stretching out like a concrete ocean. Windows that had once displayed bright advertisements and cheerful holiday decorations now stared out like hollow eye sockets. The mall had been the heart of Millbrook once, back when the auto plants were still running, and families had disposable income. Marcus could remember coming here as a little kid, riding the carousel and begging his parents for tokens at the arcade. Now it stood as a monument to economic collapse, another casualty of the town's slow death. Getting inside wasn't difficult. Security was minimal, and there were plenty of gaps in the fence that surrounded the property. They slipped through a service entrance that Tyler had scouted months earlier during one of his urban exploration phases. Inside, the mall was a cathedral of decay. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating storefronts with rusted security gates, dead plants in enormous planters, and graffiti tags left by previous trespassers. The silence was so complete it felt almost solid, broken only by the distant drip of water from a leak somewhere in the building's dying infrastructure. This place is seriously creepy, Rebecca whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the vast open space. It's like a graveyard for capitalism. They made their way toward the center of the mall, where the old fountain sat dry and filled with debris. Above them, the skylights let in just enough moonlight to create strange, shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their flashlight beams. The message mentioned a stage, Marcus said, consulting his phone. There used to be a stage here in the main court where they'd have holiday performances and stuff. Sure enough, at the far end of the central court, they found it. Small raised platform that had once hosted Christmas concerts in back-to-school fashion, shows now sat covered in dust and tagged with spray paint. It was here that children had once laughed and applauded, where families had gathered to celebrate the changing seasons. Now it stood silent and forgotten, a perfect representation of dreams that had died along with the town's prosperity. Heart of forgotten dreams where laughter died, Tyler said softly. That's got to be it. Marcus pulled out a piece of white chalk he'd brought from home, along with a printout of the symbol that had been included in the puzzle. It was strange and intricate, like a spiral that folded in on itself with a solid dot at the center. Following the instructions, he climbed onto the old stage and carefully drew the symbol on the back wall, making sure it was large enough and clear enough to be easily visible. "Okay, done," he said, stepping back to examine his work. The keeper's mark is officially left. Rebecca hugged herself, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched from the dark storefronts that surrounded the court. "Can we get out of here now? This place is seriously giving me bad vibes." They practically ran back to the exit, their footsteps echoing through the empty corridors like gunshots. It wasn't until they were safely outside, breathing the cool night air, that they finally relaxed enough to talk about what they'd just done. "That was actually pretty cool," Marcus admitted, adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Weird, but cool. See?" Tyler grinned, his earlier excitement vindicated. "I told you this would be worth it. Just wait until we see what the next challenge is." But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. As they walked home through Millbrook's empty streets, she found herself looking over her shoulder more than once, as if expecting to see something following them from the shadows of the dead mall. The next morning, Marcus woke up to a notification on his phone. A new message had arrived during the night, sent through the same anonymous system as the first challenge. Mark received. "The silence hears you. Next whisper. Capture the stone's dream at dawn's first light. Do not wake the sleeper." This time, the coordinates pointed to Millbrook's oldest cemetery, specifically to the original section that dated back to the town's founding in the 1800s. The weathered headstones and crumbling monuments there told the story of the town's earliest settlers, miners and farmers who had carved out a life in the wilderness. When Marcus shared the message with Tyler and Rebecca, the reaction was immediate and divided. "No way," Rebecca said flatly. "Absolutely not. The abandoned mall was one thing but a cemetery. At dawn, that's where I draw the line." "Come on, Becca," Tyler pleaded, though even he looked a little nervous about this escalation. "It's just old graves. The people buried there have been dead for like 100 years. They're not going to hurt anybody." "It's not about the dead people," Rebecca shot back. "It's about who's sending us to these places and why. This is getting way too intense." Marcus found himself caught between his friends, feeling the same unease that Rebecca was expressing, but also burning with curiosity about where this strange game was leading them. Maybe it's just referring to some old monument or statue. You know how cemeteries sometimes have these elaborate memorials. Despite Rebecca's protests, she found herself at the cemetery gates at 5:30 the next morning, watching the sky slowly lighten from black to deep purple to pale gold. She told herself she was only coming to keep an eye on her friends, to make sure they didn't do anything too stupid. But the truth was, she was as curious as they were about what the stone's dream might mean. Millbrook Cemetery sprawled across a low hill overlooking the old part of town. Its newer sections filled with neat rows of modern headstones, while the older areas featured elaborate Victorian monuments and weathered markers that told the story of the town's history. The boys had convinced her that this challenge was probably harmless, just taking a photograph of some historical landmark. They climbed over the low stone wall that bordered the original section, moving quietly through the morning mist that clung to the ground like ghostly fingers. The silence here was different from the mall, older and deeper, filled with the weight of generations. "There," Marcus whispered, pointing toward the center of the old section. "That has to be it." In a small clearing surrounded by tilted headstones and overgrown with wild grass, they found what could only be described as the stone's dream. It was a massive boulder, easily 6 feet across, worn smooth by centuries of weather. Unlike the carefully carved monuments around it, this stone bore no inscription, no dates, no names. It simply sat there, ancient and mysterious, as if it had been there long before the cemetery, long before the town itself. There was something unsettling about the boulder, something that made Rebecca's skin crawl. It seemed to radiate a strange energy, as if something vast and patient slumbered beneath its weathered surface. The morning mist seemed to cling to it more heavily than to the surrounding graves, creating strange patterns that shifted and moved in ways that had nothing to do with the gentle morning breeze. "Don't wake the sleeper," Tyler repeated quietly, his earlier bravado significantly dampened by the atmosphere of the place. "I guess that means we should be quiet." Rebecca raised her phone to take the required photograph, trying to capture the mysterious stone from several different angles. The morning light was perfect, casting long shadows and creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. It was just lining up what she thought would be the perfect shot when her phone made a sharp beeping sound and the screen went completely black. "What the hell?" she muttered, frantically pressing buttons. "My phone just died." "That's weird," Marcus said, pulling out his own device. "Mine was at like 90% when we left." But as soon as he raised it to take a backup photo, his phone emitted the same sharp beep and powered down completely. Tyler checked his phone and found the same thing. 3 fully charged devices, all dead simultaneously. "Okay, that's officially weird," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Phones don't just die like that." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Guys, I think we need to leave, right now." They backed away from the stone, and as soon as they were about 20 feet from it, their phones flickered back to life, showing the same battery levels they'd had before approaching the mysterious boulder. "What the hell was that?" Marcus demanded, staring at his phone in disbelief. "I don't know, but I managed to get one photo before my phone died," Rebecca said, quickly checking her gallery. Sure enough, there was a single image of the stone taken just moments before the electronic blackout. Marcus immediately uploaded the photo to the Silent Hollow interface, and within minutes they received a response. "The stone has seen you. It remembers." The silence grows louder. Next whisper, "Catch the night's voice by the dead waters. Not let it escape." This time, the coordinates led to the abandoned industrial complex by Miller's Creek, a contaminated waterway that had once powered the town's early mills. The challenge was to record 1 hour of night sounds using a digital recorder. "Dead waters, night voices," Rebecca said, reading over Marcus's shoulder. "This is getting seriously dark, guys, and the tasks are getting more dangerous." "It's just recording sounds," Tyler argued, though his enthusiasm seemed forced now. "We don't even have to stay there. We can set up a recorder and come back for it." But Rebecca had reached her breaking point. "No, I'm done. This isn't a game anymore if it ever was. Someone is deliberately sending us to creepy, isolated places in the middle of the night. This is how people get hurt or worse." Marcus looked torn, part of him agreeing with Rebecca's concerns, but part of him desperate to see where this strange journey would lead. "Maybe you're right. Maybe we should stop." "You guys do whatever you want," Rebecca said firmly. "But I'm out. And I think you should be too. Tyler and Marcus exchanged glances, and Rebecca could see the decision forming between them even before Tyler spoke. We've come this far, Tyler said quietly. We have to see it through. Rebecca felt a stab of fear and disappointment. Fine, but when this goes wrong, and it will go wrong, don't say I didn't warn you. That night, Tyler and Marcus made their way to the old industrial site with a cheap digital recorder Marcus had bought that afternoon. The abandoned complex was a maze of rusted machinery and collapsed buildings, the air thick with the smell of stagnant water and industrial decay. Miller's Creek, once a clear stream that had powered the town's mills, now ran black and oily between concrete banks. They set up the recorder on a piece of broken concrete and activated it, then retreated to a safe distance to wait. The night was unnaturally quiet, as if the presence of the contaminated water had driven away even the insects and night birds. When they returned the next morning, the recorder was exactly where they'd left it. But when they played back the audio, what they heard made their blood run cold. For the first 20 minutes, there were only the normal sounds of a quiet night, the distant hum of traffic, the whisper of wind through broken windows. But then, gradually, another sound began to emerge. A voice, low and hypnotic, speaking in what sounded like an ancient language that predated any human settlement in the area. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising from the polluted water itself. As they listened, both boys felt a strange drowsiness creeping over them, a heavy lethargy that made their eyelids feel like lead weights. "Turn it off," Tyler managed to say, fighting against the strange compulsion to keep listening. "Something's wrong." Marcus fumbled for the stop button, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy. The moment the voice stopped, they both gasped as if surfacing from deep water, their heads clearing instantly. What the hell was that? Tyler demanded, his hands shaking as he stared at the recorder. "I don't know, but we got what they wanted," Marcus replied, quickly transferring the audio file to his computer. "Let's just send them what they asked for and see what happens next." The response came within an hour. Voice heard. The city stirs. It demands the final gift. Next whisper. Bring an offering to the sleeping Lord. Blood calls to blood. Final coordinates pointed to Veterans Memorial Park in the center of town, specifically to the statue of Colonel James Millbrook, the town's founder. The task was simple and terrifying. They were to leave a drop of their own blood on the statue's base. Blood. Marcus stared at the message in disbelief. "They want us to bleed on a public monument." Tyler's reaction was strange and immediate. Instead of the revulsion Marcus expected, his friend's eyes lit up with an unsettling fervor. "Blood calls to blood," Tyler repeated slowly, as if the words held some special meaning. "Don't you see? This is it. This is the real test. Everything we've done has been leading to this moment." Marcus looked at his friend with growing alarm. Tyler seemed different somehow, changed by their experiences in ways Marcus was only beginning to understand. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of hungry obsession that made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. "Tyler, listen to yourself. You're talking about cutting yourself to please some anonymous person on the internet. This has gone way too far." But Tyler was already pulling out his pocket knife, testing the sharpness of the blade against his thumb. "You don't understand, Marcus. We've been chosen. Out of thousands of players, we've made it this far. We can't stop now, not when we're so close to the truth." "What truth?" Marcus grabbed Tyler's wrist, trying to keep him from opening the knife. "You don't even know what we're trying to accomplish here." Tyler easily pulled free, his grip stronger than Marcus remembered. "The truth about this town, about what's really underneath all the decay and boredom. There's something here, something that's been sleeping, and we're going to wake it up." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. This wasn't just Tyler being reckless anymore. This was something else, something that had been growing since they started the challenges. Or whatever it really was, had gotten its hooks into his friend. "Tyler, you're scaring me. This isn't you talking. This is more me than I've ever been," Tyler shot back, his eyes blazing with unnatural intensity. "For the first time in my life, I'm part of something important, something bigger than this dead-end town and our pathetic little lives." Marcus made one more desperate attempt to reach his friend. "What about Rebecca? She tried to warn us. She saw where this was heading before we did." "Rebecca's a coward," Tyler said with surprising venom. "She ran away when things got interesting. But we're not cowards, are we, Marcus? We're going to see this through to the end." But Marcus had finally reached his limit. The strange voice on the recording, the electronic malfunctions at the cemetery, and now Tyler's disturbing transformation had convinced him that they were involved in something far more dangerous than a simple game. "No," he said firmly. "I'm done. I'm not going to watch you hurt yourself for some sick online cult." Tyler's expression shifted from persuasive to coldly angry in an instant. "Fine, be a quitter, just like Rebecca. But I'm going to finish what we started, with or without you." That night, Marcus found himself following Tyler through the empty streets of downtown Millbrook, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to intervene if things went too far. He tried calling Rebecca, but she wasn't answering her phone. He'd even considered calling the police, but what would he tell them? That his friend was planning to commit vandalism based on instructions from an internet game. Veterans Memorial Park sat in the heart of downtown, a small green space dominated by the bronze statue of Colonel Millbrook. The town's founder stood tall and proud on his granite pedestal, one hand resting on his sword, the other shading his eyes as he gazed toward the horizon. During the day, the park was often filled with office workers eating lunch and mothers pushing strollers. But at midnight, it was completely deserted. Marcus watched from the shadows as Tyler approached the statue with an almost ritualistic solemnity. His friend knelt at the base of the monument and carefully drew the blade of his pocket knife across his palm, not flinching as blood welled up in the shallow cut. "I offer this gift freely," Tyler said aloud, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Blood calls to blood, show me the truth." He pressed his bleeding palm against the cold granite, leaving a dark stain on the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. The park remained quiet and still, just another empty space in a town full of them. Then the ground began to move. It started as a barely perceptible tremor, like the rumble of a distant freight train. But it quickly grew stronger, more insistent. The statue of Colonel Millbrook swayed on its base, and Marcus could hear the grinding of stone against stone as the monument shifted. Cracks appeared in the walkway around the statue, spreading outward like a spiderweb. From these cracks, a thick, oily mist began to seep upward, carrying with it the smell of deep earth and ancient decay. The park's streetlights flickered and died one by one, plunging the area into an unnatural darkness, broken only by the pale glow of the moon. And then they came. Rising from the cracks in the earth like smoke given form, dark shapes began to emerge. They had no definite outline, constantly shifting and flowing like liquid shadow, but Marcus could sense a terrible hunger in their movement. They surrounded Tyler, who stood transfixed at the base of the statue, his bleeding hand still pressed against the stone. "Tyler," Marcus shouted, abandoning his hiding place and running toward his friend. "Get away from there." But Tyler seemed unable to move, caught in some kind of trance as the shadow creatures circled closer. His eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and ecstasy, as if he was seeing something wonderful and horrible at the same time. "I can see it," Tyler whispered, his voice carrying impossibly clearly across the park. "The truth, it's beautiful." The shadows converged on him all at once, flowing over his body like a dark tide. Tyler's scream cut through the night air, a sound so filled with agony and despair that Marcus felt his knees buckle. He watched in helpless horror as his friend was consumed by the writhing darkness, his form becoming indistinct before vanishing entirely. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The shadows retreated back into the cracks in the earth, the mist dissipated, and the streetlights flickered back to life. The park looked exactly as it had before, peaceful and empty, except for one crucial difference. Tyler was gone, completely gone, as if he had never existed at all. Even the blood he had left on the statue's base had vanished without a trace. Marcus stood alone in the restored normalcy of the park, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. His friend had been taken, consumed by something that should not exist, something that the game had awakened or summoned. He stumbled home in a daze, his phone buzzing with a new message that he was afraid to read. But when he finally worked up the courage to look, the words on his screen made his blood freeze. Gift accepted. The sleeper stirs. You cannot simply walk away. Player 712. The game ends only when all debts are paid. Come to the crossing bridge at midnight tomorrow. Bring what anchors you to the past, or the past will come for you. The crossing bridge was an old railroad trestle that spanned Miller's Creek at the edge of town, a place known locally for suicides and accidents. And Marcus knew exactly what the message meant by what anchors you to the past. In his wallet, he carried the only photograph he had of his father, a man who had died when Marcus was 7 years old. It was his most precious possession, the only tangible connection he had to the parent he barely remembered. He tried calling Rebecca, desperate to warn her to get her help, but she wasn't answering. Finally, he sent her a text explaining everything that had happened to Tyler and begging her to meet him. Rebecca's response was immediate and terrified. "Oh God, Marcus, I knew this would happen. We have to get out of town right now. Tonight." They arranged to meet at the bus station, planning to buy tickets to anywhere that would get them far away from Millbrook and whatever was hunting them. But as Marcus was packing a bag with shaking hands, his phone rang. The number was blocked, but when he answered, he heard a voice that made his soul freeze. It was Tyler's voice, but wrong somehow, distorted and hollow as if it was coming from a great distance or depth. "Marcus," the voice said, and he could hear an echo of his friend's personality beneath the supernatural distortion. "You left me. You let them take me." "Tyler," Marcus whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "Where are you? Are you okay?" "I'm part of it now," Tyler's voice replied. "Part of the silence. And soon you will be too. The game doesn't end just because you want it to. Come to the bridge, Marcus. Come and join me." The line went dead, and immediately another message appeared on his phone. "Your friend awaits. Final choice. Come willingly and bring your anchor, or we will take you both." Marcus realized with cold certainty that he couldn't run. Whatever force was behind Silent Hollow had Tyler, and it wouldn't let either of them go until it got what it wanted. If he tried to flee, it would come after Rebecca too, and he couldn't live with that on his conscience. He called Rebecca one last time. "I have to go to the bridge." "No," she screamed into the phone. "Marcus, please just come to the bus station. We'll figure something else out." "It has Tyler," he said quietly. "And if I don't go, it'll come after you next." "I can't let that happen. Marcus, please. If I don't call you by sunrise, get out of town. Go far away and don't look back. And Rebecca, I'm sorry we didn't listen to you from the beginning." He hung up and turned off his phone, then walked out into the night for what he knew would be the last time. The crossing bridge loomed against the star-filled sky like a skeleton of rusted steel and rotting wood. It hadn't been used by trains in over a decade, and the town had been talking about tearing it down for years. Now it stood as a monument to abandonment, stretched across the dark water of Miller's Creek like a pathway to nowhere. Marcus walked slowly toward the center of the bridge, the photograph of his father clutched in his trembling hand. The night was utterly silent, except for the sound of his footsteps on the old railroad ties and the distant murmur of water flowing far below. "I'm here," he called out into the darkness. "I brought what you wanted. Now let Tyler go." The response came not from any particular direction, but seemed to emanate from the bridge itself, from the water below, from the very air around him. It was the same voice he'd heard on the recording by the creek, ancient and patient and utterly inhuman. "Foolish child," the voice whispered, and Marcus felt the words crawling across his skin like insects. "Did you think this was about exchange, about fairness? This is about awakening, about feeding what has slumbered beneath your gray little town for generations." From the far end of the bridge, a figure began to approach. At first, Marcus thought it might be Tyler, but as it drew closer, he could see that it was something else entirely. It moved with an unnatural gliding motion, its form constantly shifting between solid and shadow. Where its face should have been, 2 points of cold red light burned like distant stars. "Your friend opened the door," the thing said, and now Marcus could hear an echo of Tyler's voice mixed with something infinitely older and more malevolent. His blood, his fear, his desperate hunger for meaning in his small existence. It was exactly what we needed. "What are you?" Marcus demanded, backing away, but finding nowhere to go on the narrow bridge. "We are what sleeps beneath the surface of places like your Millbrook," the entity replied. "We are the darkness that feeds on stagnation, on despair, on the slow death of dreams. Your friend's sacrifice has given us enough strength to fully awaken." The entity reached toward him with appendages that seemed to be made of living shadow, and Marcus knew he had only one chance. Looking down at the photograph in his hand, he saw his father's kind face smiling back at him, full of love and hope for a son who would grow up without him. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, then pulled out his lighter and set the photograph ablaze. The effect was immediate and violent. The entity shrieked and recoiled as if struck by a physical blow, its form wavering and becoming less solid. The bridge itself seemed to shudder, and for a moment Marcus thought he could see Tyler's face looking out from within the creature's shifting mass. His eyes filled with recognition and desperate gratitude. The photograph burned quickly, and as the last of it turned to ash and blew away in the night wind, the entity recovered its composure. "A clever trick," it hissed, "but ultimately pointless. You have merely delayed the inevitable." The shadow thing lunged forward, and Marcus felt cold tendrils wrap around his arms and legs, lifting him from the bridge deck. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the lights of Millbrook spread out below, looking smaller and more fragile than ever before. Everything went black, and the silence was absolute. Rebecca waited by her phone until dawn, checking it every few minutes despite knowing that Marcus wouldn't call. When the sun finally rose over Millbrook's gray skyline, she knew what she had to do. She packed a single bag with her most essential belongings, bought a bus ticket with the money she'd been saving for art supplies, and left the only home she'd ever known. She never returned to Millbrook, and she never spoke of what had happened to Marcus and Tyler. Who would believe her? Who would understand that their town had been feeding something ancient and hungry, something that masqueraded as a game to lure in the young and desperate? But sometimes, late at night in whatever city she found herself in, Rebecca would dream of her friends. She would see Tyler's face in the shadows between streetlights, hear Marcus's voice whispering her name from empty alleyways, and she would know that somewhere in the silence, they were still playing the game. Years later, she would read online about other towns, other missing teenagers, other mysterious alternate reality games that appeared on obscure forums and social media platforms. The names changed, the locations shifted, but the pattern was always the same. Young people, bored and searching for meaning, drawn into something that promised adventure and delivered only darkness. Silent Hollow was still out there, still hunting, still growing stronger with each new player who thought they were clever enough to solve its puzzles and brave enough to face its challenges. The game never truly ended. It just moved on to the next gray town, the next group of restless teenagers, the next harvest of dreams and despair. And in Millbrook, if you knew where to look and when to listen, you could still find traces of what had awakened beneath the streets. The old mall remained empty, but sometimes security guards reported strange lights moving through the abandoned stores. The cemetery's ancient boulder grew a little larger each year, as if fed by something from below. The industrial site by Miller's Creek echoed with voices that spoke in languages older than human memory. The town continued its slow decline, its young people leaving as soon as they could, its remaining residents growing older and more isolated with each passing year. Now there was something else in the air, along with the perpetual gray clouds, something that whispered promises of excitement and purpose to anyone desperate enough to listen. Silent Hollow was patient. It could wait. There would always be more players, more searchers, more young souls hungry for something beyond the mundane reality of their everyday lives. And when they came looking for adventure, for mystery, for a story worth telling, it would be waiting for them. Game, after all, was never really about winning. It was about feeding the silence that lurked beneath the surface of forgotten places, giving it strength to spread to new towns, new victims, new players who thought they were smart enough to beat a system designed to consume them. In the end, the only way to win was not to play at all. But that was a lesson that few learned until it was far too late, and the silence had already claimed them as its own. Rebecca learned it, though. She learned it well. And sometimes, when she saw young people on their phones, scrolling through mysterious forums and boasting about the dangerous games they'd discovered, she wanted to warn them. But she knew they wouldn't listen. They never did. After all, who would believe that a simple online game could be so dangerous? Who would take seriously the warnings of a woman who claimed that something ancient and evil was hunting through the internet, using boredom and curiosity as bait? So Rebecca kept her silence, carried her knowledge like a burden, and hoped that somewhere out there, someone else would be smart enough to walk away before it was too late. Because Silent Hollow was still playing, still hunting, still growing stronger, and it was always looking for new players. Author of the story, Marcus Thompson. A sharp pain shot through my ears as they began to ring. Without thinking, I instinctively pressed my broken arm against my chest. A moment later, an icy chill washed over the back of my head, and my hair fell across my flushed face. He pushed me away roughly, decisively. I tried to catch his gaze one last time, but our eyes never met that evening. We were passing time after another exhausting day that had brought no results. Several weeks ago, our colleagues from the wildlife research team had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in the remote Appalachian Mountains where we had worked together before. The head of our ecological expedition simply stopped responding on the radio at the scheduled time one day, and attempts to reach any of the missing team members proved fruitless. Our research group ventured into the mountains to search for our colleagues. Search and rescue teams had already been working the area, but despite their best efforts, they couldn't find anyone. We, however, refused to give up hope and continued our search despite the lack of results. In the corner of the room, a generator hummed monotonously while we sat around a table, taking turns playing cards. Occasional shouts of joy or disappointment rang out here and there. Only I wasn't fully engaged in the game, my mind consumed by thoughts of our unachieved goal. From time to time, the colleague sitting next to me would nudge my shoulder, reminding me it was my turn. I would mindlessly place the first card that came to hand on the pile and sink back into my thoughts. We had been living on the edge of this mountain wilderness for more than half the time allocated for our expedition. Yet, we hadn't found anything that could help us in our continued search. I was pulled from my heavy contemplation by Ember's harsh coughing fit, which came so suddenly that each of us jumped. The young woman bent low over the wooden floor, her whole body trembling as she pressed her palm to her mouth. Her chest rose high and fell rapidly under her thick sweater, as if each breath came with tremendous difficulty. After a few moments, she pulled her fingers away from her lips and desperately tried to hide the alarm that instantly appeared on her face. A small trickle of blood slowly ran down her skin. Brett immediately offered her a glass of water, but Ember politely declined, assuring us she was fine. I immediately rolled up my sleeve and rubbed my index finger over a small wound on my wrist that had just begun to heal. My colleagues and I had noticed early in our search that we felt worse with each passing day. Strangely, this illness wasn't accompanied by high fever, headaches, or weakness. We began to notice with horror that we developed frequent coughing fits with blood that gradually began to take on an unpleasant, putrid smell. This stench forced us to bandage our wounds with thick cloth to get rid of it. I became afraid of any sharp objects since all my scratches, even the most minor ones, healed incredibly slowly. The skin around cuts would become completely pale and almost colorless after a couple of days, and sometimes I even thought I could see something moving beneath it. Blood clotted with difficulty, and stopping it was very challenging. Another strange symptom was hallucinations. Every day while doing our work, I seemed to see the missing researchers. Most often, their elusive, motionless figures appeared before me in the forest, hiding behind tall trees and wading waist-deep through snowdrifts. I was immediately overcome by an irresistible desire to rush toward them. But my colleagues always stopped me in time. Jake stubbornly suggested I abandon the search and leave, but none of the other researchers supported this idea. For us, finding our teammates was a matter of honor, and we were ready to do everything possible to save them, regardless of our illness. "Hey, Mike," Benton distracted me from my thoughts once again. "You're losing again. Please pay attention." I irritably shrugged my shoulders and threw my cards aside with all my strength. They immediately slid off the smooth surface of the table and fell to the floor. Everyone looked at me with suspicious glances, as if asking an unspoken question. Brett even demonstratively moved away from me, immediately standing up and pushing his chair as far away as possible. "Sorry," I said distractedly, helplessly spreading my hands. I felt ashamed of my thoughtless, stupid act. The day had been too difficult. Right now, I can't concentrate on the game, and I don't want to ruin it for you. So I think I'll go to sleep. Good night to you all. After taking an ice-cold shower to calm my agitated nerves, I finally lay down in bed, but I couldn't fall asleep that night. Suffering from insomnia, I finally decided to go to the kitchen to find some medicine. Already at the threshold, I was caught by an indignant and frightened exclamation from the neighboring room. The light bulb above me immediately flickered ominously, as if someone invisible had lightly struck the lampshade, after which there was a deafening crack and the electricity went out throughout the cabin. The steady hum of the refrigerator in the corner of the room fell silent, replaced by the sound of menacing animal growling that shook the wooden walls of the dwelling. At that moment, even the silence hanging in the kitchen seemed threatening to me, hiding something unfamiliar and dangerous. I didn't want to stay alone at all, so I ran to my colleagues who were trying to figure out the cause of the generator breakdown. Ember nervously bustled around near the men, fearfully looking back. "What do you think?" I said as soon as I entered the room. Brett and Jake immediately jumped from surprise and began to look around in bewilderment until they finally noticed my indistinct silhouette in the corner of the room. "What's making that noise outside?" "Wild animals, probably," Ember said uncertainly, habitually wrapping her arms around her shoulders. "Mike," Brett suddenly looked up, breaking away from studying the generator. For a moment, it seemed to me that his brown eyes, which seemed completely black in the pitch darkness, flashed malevolently at me. I managed with difficulty to drive away this foolish obsession. "Well, why are you standing there doing nothing? You'd better bring some candles. You can't see anything," he said. Without saying a word, I ran to the kitchen, trying my best not to look around. It seemed to me that if I raised my head even for a moment, I would immediately see something terrible and inexplicable. A few minutes later, I was standing among my colleagues again, leaning low over the generator and holding a candle. A disgusting sour smell hit my nostrils, coming from the machine. Only after some more time did an unexpected guess come to my mind. It was that someone had deliberately poured a substance into the generator that ruined it. This stranger clearly wanted to leave us without electricity and communication with the outside world. I told Brett about this, but he didn't take my words seriously and just laughed sincerely. Ember circled behind our backs around the room all this time, sometimes sitting down in an armchair, then suddenly jumping up from it and impatiently looking out the window opposite. When she approached us again to watch the work, I finally decided to ask a question. "Ember, is everything okay? Did something happen?" My hand firmly squeezed her fragile shoulder, and the candlelight illuminated her tense, pale face. The girl immediately recoiled, as if from a blow, and roughly threw my fingers down. "Yes, you're right," she croaked and turned away. "We have serious problems. Can we step aside and talk?" Desperately trying to maintain outward calm, I placed the candle on the windowsill and followed the girl. Ember behaved unusually restrained and indifferent, but it was easy to catch anxiety in her constrained movements. We went into the neighboring room, and my friend firmly closed the door behind her, as if afraid that we might be overheard. Pressing her back tightly against it, she remained silent for a long time, gathering strength. As soon as she began to speak, carefully choosing each word, a loud knock suddenly sounded at the window behind my back. Before my eyes, as if from nowhere, appeared the unclear silhouette of a terrible creature, frantically beating its paws against the glass, hoping to break it. Its disproportionate body and huge bare head pressed tightly against the window, while long fingers with sharp, curved claws drew incomprehensible, intricate symbols on it. Once again, in a moment, completely white, bloodshot human eyes flashed in my imagination, greedily studying me, and an animal snarl twisted in a disgusting smile. "Help me, I beg you, let me in." From surprise, I immediately froze in place, having managed to take only a small step forward to the door. The voice I heard was remotely similar to a man's, but something on a subconscious level told me directly that this was not the case at all. Fear instantly seized me, binding my limbs and depriving them of sensitivity. My friend quickly crouched down, so she wouldn't be seen from outside, and froze motionlessly. "Is this person?" I asked tensely in a whisper. "I don't know," Ember answered, barely moving her frozen lips. The drumbeat of blows on the glass, repeated with new force, brought me out of my stupor. On cotton legs that barely supported my heavy body, I ran toward the exit from the cabin. After standing a little longer to finally come to my senses, Ember decided to follow my example. In the corridor, alarmed Jake and Brett blocked our way, having also heard the cries for help. There was no time to explain what was happening to our colleagues, so we had to simply ignore them. Through the snow flurry that filled our eyes, we saw a tall silhouette wandering toward us. Despite all my worst fears about forest monsters, a man approached the cabin, desperately waving his free right hand. The stranger was dressed only in a pajama shirt and long torn pants, through which deep bleeding wounds on his legs were visible. Howling gutturally from pain, the man entered the house with our help and settled in the living room on the couch. Ember and I were surprised to recognize in the victim a forester familiar to us, an unkempt and rough man who lived in isolation from everyone in his nearby guard station. Jake and Brett immediately rushed to different rooms in search of warm clothes and a first aid kit, while we stayed with the forester. For some inexplicable reason, he still kept his left hand under his clothes, and to my requests to show it, he responded only with a negative nod of his head. This seemed suspicious to me, but I didn't insist. Very soon Brett and Jake returned to the room and bustled around the guest. In just a couple of minutes, the forester completely came to his senses, and introducing himself as Thomas, announced that he was ready to talk with us. "Tell us what happened to you," Brett said in a commanding voice. He sat right on the floor in front of the man, while we settled a little behind. "I was sure," the forester said, stammering in a trembling voice, "that this wouldn't happen to me." "What wouldn't happen?" Jake interrupted the man impatiently. Brett immediately looked at him disapprovingly and ordered him to be silent. "I hoped they wouldn't come," Thomas answered, not at all bothered by being interrupted. At that moment, he was too alarmed to notice such trifles. The dead. It all started a very long time ago, several centuries ago. According to the stories of my colleague, Forrester Cole, who studied these places during his work, right in this area of the mountains, real Cherokee shamans once lived. They were isolated from other people and seriously engaged in magic. Despite the fact that the residents of the nearest town considered the local sorcerers and tried not even to approach their village once again, the townspeople were always ready to help them. Some city dwellers came here to be cured of terrible ailments, and with the help of the locals, the disease could be overcome. So the villagers lived for a long time in harmony and peace with each other, mastering more and more witchcraft tricks. But one day, a geological expedition came here to study the territory. They immediately established their own rules, although it remains unknown whether they had any right to do so. The geologists forbade the locals from leaving their territory, and even determined the hours when the villagers were allowed to be on the street. The freedom-loving shamans were outraged by such provocative behavior of uninvited guests, and constantly violated the rules, not afraid of cruel punishments. However, the mockery of the locals became more and more sophisticated, and one day, seriously fearing for their lives, the sorcerers gave up. Each of them hated the cruel geologists, and placed a curse on the village. It consisted in the fact that from now on, every person who dared to cross the border would die either from a disease that slowly kills the body from the first day of stay here, or from an attack by the dead living nearby. According to Cole's stories, the dead became the very geologists who cruelly mocked the villagers and their colleagues who worked here later. Their bodies were struck by a terrible virus. However, I learned that some people have something like immunity that can protect them from this disease, but it cannot protect them from the local evil spirits. If you were ever wounded by a dead person, for example, bitten or left even a very small scratch, you know you're doomed. In such a scenario, you have no chance of salvation, even if you immediately go to the hospital. You will become one of them. I, by the way, like my escaped colleague, unfortunately turned out to have immunity. However, it's impossible to know whether you're endowed with it. You can only hope for luck. You know, at first I didn't even believe Cole's story, thinking that from loneliness he had simply gone mad. However, now I'm convinced of the opposite. I should have listened to him then. The man nervously rubbed his right hand against the collar of the donated coat thrown over his shoulders and exhaled heavily. Ember coughed violently again, and her entire fragile body was again seized with convulsions, making her tremble finely. "Guys," she said in a hoarse, very low voice. Her blue eyes nervously darted from side to side, and her lips twitched constantly. Cole told me this same story about the shamans. We met with him before the trip. I just wanted to learn something about this place to make it easier to work. When I asked why he left, Cole answered that the dead attacked him and almost finished him off. But I was sure that all this was untrue. I thought he had simply gone mad. At that very moment, Brett jumped up from the couch and screamed piercingly, looking around with a mad gaze. "So you knew all this time where we ended up and didn't say a word to us? How could you do that, Ember?" In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he swung at the girl, but at the last moment managed to stop his palm an inch from her temple. Ember instinctively turned away, protecting her face, and fearfully closed her eyes. Jake rushed to pull Brett away from the helpless girl, but he had already switched his attention to the forester. "And what are you hiding your hand for? Show it quickly." "Brett, that's enough," I said demandingly, getting up from the bed and preparing to stop the fight if necessary. The atmosphere in the room was heating up every second. Ember was quietly crying, huddled in the very corner of the bed and throwing glances at Brett from under her brows, while Jake was unsuccessfully trying to calm him down. Thomas, in turn, pressed even harder into the back of the chair and hid his left forearm deeper under his coat. "Don't try to calm me down," my colleague shouted, waving his palms clenched into fists. "I told you, immediately take off that coat." When Thomas again flatly refused to do this, Brett began to pull out his left hand himself. Rough curses and Ember's hysterical sobs pressed on my head like red-hot vices, until it finally began to buzz with pain. I could no longer see how Brett tore the forester's forearm from under his clothes and exposed it, rolling up the pajama sleeve high. My ears hummed with a low bass, and words soaked through with hidden horror and hatred. "Get out of here." I seemed to watch from the side as Brett struck the forester's head several times against the fireplace located next to the couch, after which, with the same furious expression on his face, he began to push him into the corridor. Ember desperately begged me to stop Brett, screaming piercingly, every time she heard the forester's heart-rending wheeze from the other room. Very soon she was no longer speaking, but simply howling without stopping. I only came to my senses when a fierce cold blew from the side, and I heard Brett's voice calling for help. On cotton legs, I rushed to my colleagues and ran out into the corridor. At the same moment, a terrible picture appeared before my eyes, which seems to be forever imprinted in my memory. Holding the door with both hands, Thomas stood on the threshold, desperately resisting Brett's blows. His entire face was covered with abrasions and bruises, and blood flowed from his mouth and nose, flooding everything around. My colleague was furiously beating his fists against Thomas's twisted fingers, unsuccessfully trying to throw them off the door jamb. The forester, overcoming pain, still held tightly to the wood, scratching it with his sharp nails, unwilling to give up. Turning my gaze to the street, I unexpectedly saw several approaching dark silhouettes resembling terribly hunched people with broken limbs. My throat immediately dried up, and my tongue refused to obey, so no matter how I tried, I couldn't warn in time about the danger lurking behind. Enraged by the fight, Brett didn't immediately notice the monsters cleverly hiding behind the trees, and didn't have time to react when something pulled the forester back with insane force. The geologist, who couldn't hold on, fell to his knees and immediately found himself surrounded by these freaks. Their rotting, ugly faces with sunken and elongated features hung low over Brett, hiding him from me. Deeply set yellow eyes with frozen vertical pupils coldly examined their helpless victim, frozen from the overwhelming horror. Naked, disproportionate bodies, completely covered with terrible abscesses, scars, and bruises, trembled barely noticeably, as if from piercing cold. Ribs protruding far forward rose high under thin, translucent skin and fell again, forcing the dead to lean even lower. Some of the corpses even retained sparse, thin hair. It was gray, thin, and long, reaching to the shoulder blades. A little later, having examined the dead more closely, I discovered that their crooked arms and necks were disfigured by deep bites. The skin around them was covered with a strange rash of dark red color that depicted an unfamiliar symbol remotely resembling a spear. But what struck me most at that moment was that the forester still continued to hold the door of our cabin open, clearing the way for the evil spirits. Even having lost his legs below the knees, their scraps were zealously divided between themselves by two dead geologists, with pleasure pushing their prey into their throats and choking from impatience and greed. The forester's eyes, who was barely holding on to consciousness, were directed toward me. He seemed to silently reproach me for inaction. I was about to help him, but at that very moment, Ember appeared in the corridor, and Jake, having difficulty dragging me away from the door, hurried to help Brett. But he had already managed to get out on his own and run into the house. The dead, having lost their victim, rushed after him. While my colleagues panicked and rushed around my bedroom, which had become our temporary refuge, I managed to find a rifle reliably hidden in the room. I wasn't sure that such a weapon, originally intended for protection from wild animals, could save us from real dead people. But there was simply no other way out. In just a couple of minutes, I was explaining the retreat plan to my colleagues, but none of them could concentrate. Ember was just shaking and looking around fearfully, expecting an attack from the corpses. Jake was completely detached, and Brett didn't want to listen to me at all. I desperately wanted to drop everything and run alone, but I couldn't leave my teammates. They were too depressed to be able to get out without help. After several agonizing minutes that felt like whole hours, we heard the heavy footsteps of many feet behind the slightly open door. "When these freaks come in," I whispered with my lips only to the geologists gathered around me, "we all have to run in opposite directions so they can't catch us together. If we retreat in pairs or in a bunch, we'll be trapped. Do you understand? We have to confuse them at least for a couple of seconds to buy time." The geologists obediently nodded and tensed up, preparing to flee. At that very moment, a huge crowd of dead people burst into the bedroom. The cramped room filled with a vile corpse stench that cut into the nostrils, and my insides seemed to turn inside out from disgust. My lungs compressed, and my heart skipped a beat when I suddenly realized that my plan was impossible. There were too many corpses. Gray faces twisted in predatory grimaces flashed rapidly before me, merging into a single outline. I was about to tell my colleagues that we needed to forget about plans and save ourselves when I heard a hissing wheeze behind me. It was Brett moving a small but heavy nightstand along the wall toward Jake, who found himself trapped between a wardrobe and the wall. Instantly realizing what they were going to do to him, he tried to move forward a little, but Brett turned out to be much more agile than his colleague, and in just a couple of seconds, the poor guy was trapped by the furniture. He only helplessly jerked his hands in different directions, trying to move the nightstand and cursing Brett with the dirtiest words. The dead, sensing easy prey, rushed toward Jake, momentarily leaving us alone. Without wasting time, we ran out into the corridor and rushed away, pursued by the curses of the doomed geologist, which soon turned into screams of pain. Only when I found myself in the corridor did I notice the serious wound I had received in the commotion when one of the corpses tried to attack me. A bone with sharp edges, surrounded by torn scraps of flesh, had broken through the skin on my forearm and now protruded far forward. Every touch to the wound caused unbearable pain, so I had to hastily hang it on my jacket sleeve. I wrapped one edge around the broken limb and secured the other on my neck. The rifle in my healthy hand slowed my movement, but I couldn't abandon the weapon. Ember stopped and rested her palms on her bent knees, gasping from the fast running. "We can't just take and abandon Jake to be torn apart by these monsters. We need to." "If you want," Brett growled dully through tightly clenched teeth, "I can take you back. Just think carefully whose life is more important to you, yours or his." Ember looked gloomily at the man ready to push her back into the cabin swarming with corpses. She was about to answer him something, but I managed to interrupt her in time. "Please stop. We need to get out of here. First, let's find the Forester's guard station. I roughly understand where it's located." Brett raised his eyebrows distrustfully, forcing me to explain immediately. During the trip, I studied the map of the area a little. Going around the already cold, mutilated corpse of the Forester, we headed away. It was insanely difficult to walk. The thick layer of snow made each next step heavier than the previous one, as if specifically slowing us down. After several dozen yards, a heart-rending scream and loud sounds of struggle suddenly rang out behind my back. I immediately looked back and saw how several dead people were trying to grab Ember, surrounding her from all sides. The girl each time deftly dodged the blows, but their ring was tightening, driving my friend into a trap. Brett stood without moving so as not to attract attention to himself, and whispered something to me with his lips only. At that very moment, the rifle fell from my numb fingers, and I hurried to help Ember. I could no longer see how Brett grabbed the weapon and rushed away. He wanted to get out of this cursed place as quickly as possible, and was ready to easily sacrifice anyone for his salvation. However, at that moment, I didn't care at all that my colleague had deceived me. In any case, Brett didn't manage to escape. I approached the girl in a couple of jumps, driven only by stupid self-sacrifice, and pulled her hand toward me. It seemed like just a little more, and I would manage to pull the girl out of the monster's clutches. But I only made the situation worse. Now only one could retreat from the circle, either me or Ember. I was about to push her out with dignity, taking the blow upon myself, but my friend turned out to be faster. I saw how for a couple of moments she hesitated in indecision, afraid to make a choice, but at the very last moment she overcame herself. I didn't even feel the first push. My legs, as if rooted to the spot, stubbornly resisted, leaving my body motionless. And a moment later I fell into the snow, without even having time to look at my friend one last time. Her soft facial features instantly roughened, became noticeably coarser and sharper, and her helplessly trembling lips compressed into a thin line. She saved me at the cost of her own life. I still unconsciously blame myself for her death, although I understand that I have nothing to do with it. Ember chose this herself. My broken arm ached again from hitting the ground. It popped out of the makeshift splint. There was no time to wrap it with my jacket again, so I left it lying in the same place. Before rushing away again, I turned around for a moment and saw that the dead had completely surrounded Ember. One of them approached the girl very close, leaned his pale face over her, distorted in a grimace of admiration, and sharply grabbed her thin neck with his fingers. Sharp, long nails went deep into the flesh and returned back with a disgusting sound. Ember immediately began to desperately gasp for air, and even tried to cover the wounds with her palms. But despite all her suffering, she didn't have time to stop the blood flowing in a scarlet stream. Impatient corpses pounced on the girl in a moment, pushing and overtaking each other on the go to be the first to reach their victim. I didn't want to watch my friend's agonizing death anymore, so I quickly headed in the opposite direction. Only at that moment did I discover that Brett had run away with my rifle. But this discovery didn't evoke any emotions in me. No anger, no resentment, no desire for revenge. Nothing. At that moment, only boundless emptiness was eating me from the inside. My path lay to the cabin and the rotting corpse of the forester nearby. I could barely keep myself together while I rummaged through the man's pants, my gaze constantly bumping into his missing lower part. Instead of legs, he had only caked stumps more like shapeless pieces of meat, and behind them stretched in sweeping red trail. I covered Thomas's body with clothes and went around it from behind so as not to accidentally fall into the clutches of the dead. My palm pleasantly warmed the sharp blade of the finished knife stolen from the forester. Passing by the window of my bedroom, I looked inside and immediately recoiled, bending strongly to remain unnoticed. Inside, illuminated only by the weak light of a candle, Jake slowly wandered from corner to corner. He had become one of them. His colorless eyes, covered with a whitish film, were dully fixed on one point, and his head was slightly lowered to his left shoulder. The man wore only meager scraps of clothing that exposed old wounds. Pieces of skin hung in flaps from his arms and legs, revealing yellowish bones, and his chest was covered with deep bleeding cuts. For a moment, the corpse's head turned toward the window. Jerking sharply, I immediately caught the mindless gaze of the dead man and crouched down. Only after a couple of minutes did I manage to get up and look out the window again. Contrary to all my fears, Jake just continued walking from corner to corner, muttering something to himself under his breath with his lips only. Exhaling with difficulty, I continued on my way, and with each next step, I squeezed the knife handle tighter in my fingers. My journey turned out to be too long. I walked much more than I initially supposed. Having strayed from the route, I reached the forester's hut only at dawn, when the cabin was already far behind. I unexpectedly met Brett. He was crawling through the snow straight toward me, his mad eyes bulging. With each yard, he became weaker, but he continued to move stubbornly toward me, screaming loudly in pain. Only when I came closer did I discover that the man's stomach was ripped open, from which internal organs fell right onto the snow. Despite all the horror of what was happening, the only feeling I experienced at that moment was surprise. I didn't understand how Brett, with such a wound, was still conscious and even moving. From the long strip of blood stretching behind him, it was clear that he had traveled a considerable distance. I came to my senses only when his icy fingers tightly gripped my ankle and furiously pulled it toward him. It immediately became clear that he didn't intend to let me go. After hesitating a little, I still pulled out the finished knife from my pocket and slashed the sharp blade across Brett's knuckles. Roaring in pain, he let me go and pressed the ugly stumps to his lips. "Here," I said dryly, throwing the knife onto the snow at my colleague's hands. The weapon landed literally an inch from Brett's face, making him jerk his whole body in the opposite direction. "Use it so you don't suffer." Smiling coldly with my lips only, I passed by my colleague and wandered on, accompanied only by quiet curses. Every 30 feet, noticing some movement in the darkness with the corner of my eye, I fell into the snow or hid behind the nearest tree. Only after a couple of minutes, having come to my senses a little, I noticed that I was frightened by an ordinary spruce branch swaying in the strong wind. The first night of my journey, I was incredibly lucky. I didn't meet a single freak. The forest seemed to help me get out. However, very soon, corpses with embittered faces and lips twisted in grimaces of rage began to pass by me. Some of them turned out to be very close to me, crouched down, and drew in the icy air with their narrow, elongated nostrils, as if trying to pick up a trail. They felt that someone had been near them, but each time I managed to remain unnoticed. Walking in complete darkness and silence, not knowing the exact path, was insanely scary. But I decisively took the next step each time, barely overcoming myself. After several hours of unsuccessful wandering, I was completely exhausted and sat right in the snow, leaning my back against the nearest pine. I had just lowered my head to my chest and closed my eyes for a moment when I distinctly felt someone's presence. Sharply raising my head, I discovered a decomposing, skinny corpse that was kneeling right in front of me, almost pressing his ugly face to mine. It seemed that any moment now he would sink his sharp fangs into my neck, envelop me with the disgusting stench of his mouth, making my consciousness cloud, and begin to kill me with pleasure. Scarlet blood would splash onto the snow, melt it, and I would feel only my tense muscles cramping and my limbs no longer obeying me. I could no longer keep myself together. Tears flowed from my eyes against my will, and my lips trembled in an inaudible whisper, begging the dead man to stop. I was sure he didn't understand and didn't even hear me, but I continued to convulsively beg for mercy. I felt that a little more and I would break into a scream, but after a couple of moments, the dead man recoiled from me. He nervously sniffed, but the strong wind prevented him from smelling me, stubbornly distracting him. Only at that moment did I finally understand that the corpse was blind and couldn't see me at all. His vertical pupils and gray eyes darted from side to side, but couldn't focus on anything specific. Exhaling inaudibly, I pressed harder against the tree trunk and threw my head up, swallowing salty tears. For some unknown reason, the forest protected me, saving me from death each time by waving its scythe right in front of my face. Finally, when the corpse, having caught another trail, rushed away, I barely got to my feet and headed forward. After walking several hundred yards, I noticed my rifle in the snow, probably dropped by Brett himself, and threw it over my shoulder. With the discovery of the weapon, some confidence in my strength settled in my soul. I walked a little faster, but even having sped up, I found the small wooden hut only after several more hours of long searching. All this time, I had to walk guided only by rare familiar details that I had seen on the map before the trip. On the windowsill of the hut stood an almost completely burned-out candle, in the weak light of which one could make out only a very tiny patch of the room. Looking through the window and finding no one, I impatiently headed to the front door. I had to pull the massive iron ring that served as a door handle several times with force before I found myself on the threshold. Another moment, and a twisted figure of a young man jumped out at me from the darkness of the corner. Stunned by fright, I just recoiled, allowing the freak to push me right into the snow. A second later, the dead man was sitting on my chest and furiously snarling, leaning lower and lower. He deftly held his teeth across the rifle, which I reflexively held out in front of me for protection. I could barely keep him at a distance. I understood that very soon I would give up. After all, my weakened hands couldn't withstand such a load, and the weapon flew to the side. I immediately felt the heavy, chilling breath of the dead man on my neck, preparing to sink his rotten fangs into my flesh, and heard the sounds he made, similar to guttural animal growling. My heart stopped for a moment, striking the chest with incredible force when something lightly touched my skin. However, I didn't give up, and I still managed to reach for the rifle at the last moment. At that moment, I desperately wanted to take revenge on the corpses for my colleagues, and was ready to fight even so that retribution would overtake at least one of them. My fingers, already losing sensitivity from the cold, touched the metal and pulled it toward me with enormous speed. The dead man, sensing the threat, growled louder and tried to tear the rifle away with his own hands. But this time, I turned out to be much more nimble and managed to quickly turn on my side, pressing the rifle to my chest. With each moment, I felt him pressing me harder to the ground with his legs, constraining my movement. With difficulty grasping the icy barrel of the rifle with the trembling fingers of my healthy hand, I aimed it toward the dead man. The corpse in one movement overcame the small distance separating us and grabbed my wounded forearm, breaking the protruding bone in several more places. Roaring in wild pain that instantly pierced my arm, I finally shot the freak. A sharp clap momentarily deafened me, making me recoil, and the heavy stock painfully hit my shoulder. The dead man, still sitting on me, swayed and fell into the snow with a choking growl. Under his throat spread a puddle of black, stinking liquid that melted the snow around. My clothes, yellowed from the foul water, slowed down each of my next steps. A black spot rapidly spread across my broken forearm, which was a clear sign of blood poisoning, and I myself felt my temperature rising. Only after a couple of minutes did I manage to reach the forester's hut and go inside. Almost all the furniture had been pushed against the wooden door. A round, small table, a couple of nightstands, and even a single metal bed with rusty springs. Sitting right on the floor, I began to examine my body for bites or serious injuries, shivering from fever. The weak flame of the candle illuminated smooth areas of untouched skin. I even relaxed, confident that I had managed to escape. Suddenly, a completely inconspicuous scarlet scratch on my thigh with torn edges gleamed right before my eyes. The candle went out at the same moment, but I, paying no attention to this, continued to feel the wound. From my touches, it began to ache slightly, and I became more and more convinced that the dead man had still managed to infect me. My head began to split with pain, whitish circles floated before my tearing eyes, and my throat became dry. Before losing consciousness, I still managed to reach the landline phone and somehow explain to the rescuers what had happened to me. I had to justify the entire nightmare by an attack by wild beasts. In just 4 hours, still holding the receiver in my weakened hand, I fell into an anxious sleep. I woke up when someone's cold fingers touched my forehead and gently massaged my temples. A man in bright blue work clothes leaned over me. Seeing that I had come to my senses, he immediately shouted something to the other rescuers. The stranger gently patted my cheeks, not letting me lose consciousness, and a smile suddenly began to appear on my face. Well, how could I think I would die from this little scratch? Yes, of course, it was left by the corpse itself. But this is not a serious wound and not even a bite. Somewhere deep in my subconscious, a decisive voice stubbornly shouted that I needed to send the rescuers back to the city. I should turn into a corpse in this place so as not to cause anyone harm. The voice whispered that it would be better for me to kill myself right now so as not to suffer, because I could no longer be saved. For a couple of moments, this voice even took control of my actions, and my hands involuntarily reached for the rifle. The rescuer didn't understand what I was doing, so he just silently watched me without stopping me. In the place where I last saw the rifle, it wasn't there. A relieved sigh burst from my chest at that very moment. The voice began to desperately offer me to find another object for suicide, but with each next word, it became quieter and more incomprehensible, and in the end, it disappeared altogether. The forest opposed it, instilling completely different thoughts in my mind. It convinced me that I simply had to survive at any cost, having gone through some terrible torments. Sitting in the warm cabin of the helicopter, I looked out the window down at the winter landscapes that seemed so beautiful in the light of the rising sun. My shoulders were warmed by a thick woolen blanket. My damaged arm was tightly fixed, and strong pills lowered my temperature, causing mild drowsiness. The rescuers tried to talk to me several times about what had happened, but seeing my condition, they finally abandoned this idea. I just smiled stupidly, thoughtlessly nodding my head in response to their questions, and very soon fell asleep. Only a few days have passed since that moment, but I began to feel much worse. I can't eat normally. My stomach simply doesn't digest food. Just one look at food causes vomiting. The sight of blood is no longer disgusting to me as before. On the contrary, I began to scratch my wounds more and more often to see it. Sometimes I even removed the bandage hiding the stump that remained after my arm was amputated to the shoulder, and enjoy this terrible sight. In such moments, I simply can't control myself. More and more often, people annoy me, especially other patients. I can't talk to them for longer than 10 minutes. If one of my roommates doesn't shut up for too long, I want to kill him on the spot. Several times I even beat up such a chatterbox, for which I was transferred to a special ward. No matter how the doctors tried to hide it, I still heard more than once how they advised others to stay as far away from me as possible. After these conversations, patients completely stopped talking to me, and they try not even to approach my ward. They're afraid that I'll harm them. The doctors told the patients about the monstrous loss I had suffered and connected my aggressive behavior precisely with it. The orderlies themselves are not afraid of me, but in their movements I sometimes notice a certain indecision and constraint. When visiting me, they hardly talk and try to get out of the ward as quickly as possible. With each hour, I feel worse and worse. The temperature can no longer be brought down by anything. The blood has completely stopped clotting, and my limbs are cramping more and more often. No matter how I convince myself that I can still be helped, the inner voice is getting louder. He's sure I'm doomed. It seems I myself began to believe in this. Loud female screams for help rang out from the hospital corridor. A nurse who could barely stand on her feet from weakness was immediately assisted by a doctor who was making his daily rounds of patients at that time. Looking into a solitary ward located away from all the others, the doctor immediately rushed inside. On a perfectly made bed lay a smiling young man without moving. If not for the bloody cut gaping right on his neck, one might think he was just sleeping soundly. Running up to the patient, the doctor dropped to his knees and squeezed his wrist with his fingers, trying to feel the pulse. The doctor's fears were justified. The man was dead. His large blue eyes, covered with haze, expressed nothing but calm. It seemed as if the suicide had not suffered from pain at all before death. His healthy hand rested on his chest, weakly squeezing a bloody scalpel, probably left here by one of the forgetful orderlies. A notebook in a leather cover and a pen replacing a bookmark also lay there. The doctor exhaled tiredly and rose to his feet, studying the pale face of the corpse and the wide, inappropriate smile. "Is this that Michael?" the nurse asked in a trembling voice, not daring to cross the threshold. His colleagues disappeared in the mountains, right? I was also told that the rescuers were able to find only one man who stuck a knife in his own neck. The girl had already begun to tell the whole story in detail, but the doctor stopped her with a sharp wave of his palm. "Yes," he said dryly, and slowly lowered the dead man's eyelids. "It's him. Please call the orderlies." The girl obediently nodded her head and suddenly coughed, bending in half. The sleeve of her loose gown exposed her wrist, on which a deep bite gaped. A spear of small, seemingly pulsating spots resembling a rash pierced it from left to right. The doctor paid no attention to this. only continuing to study the dead patient. After coughing, the nurse hurriedly left the ward and slowly walked down the corridor, while Mike just continued to smile, still as blissfully and submissively. Well then, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately Michael still managed to transmit this infection. And I hope that either they will cure the nurse or she herself will guess and do what she must do, because subjecting others to such enormous danger is irresponsible. If you listen to the story to the very end, leave a snowflake emoji so we know how many of us listened to the story to the very end. And I, as always, don't say goodbye to you, because we'll hear each other again where? That's right, in the next terrifyingly interesting story. Villages have a way of disappearing. Sooner or later, the last person leaves their home, never to return, or death takes them away. Without human presence, houses wither like flowers deprived of water in a cracked pot on a dusty windowsill. Empty rooms become home to dust, cobwebs, and hungry mice. Outside, moss claims the walls, sharing space with lichen. On rooftops, wind-blown leaves quietly dry and decay. Occasional strangers venturing into forgotten settlements carry away valuable old things no longer needed by their owners. Over time, houses lean toward the earth, overgrown with grass. And after decades, what was once a thriving village becomes nothing but a pile of rotting timber or crumbling brick. Michael walked past dying settlements that changed every few hundred yards. Somewhere, skeletal frames of houses still stood. Elsewhere, structures had collapsed like houses of cards. In each abandoned place, weeds reigned supreme. Birds rested on logs protruding from the undergrowth. Insects crawled over rusted pieces of iron that had once been farm equipment. The man remembered how, as a child, every time he drove past the scattered villages around the area, he would notice with a sadness incomprehensible to a child the increasing number of abandoned homes. He imagined the village where his parents lived as the same desolate place, overgrown with tall grass, thorny bushes, and nettles among whose stems scurried mice, rabbits, hedgehogs, and raccoons that had emerged from the forest. High in the sky, birds soared, chirping merrily while hunting insects. Walking along the narrow dirt path dotted with puddles of liquid mud, the man tried to understand what could possibly make people settle in such remote places, far from civilization, where often there weren't even basic amenities. He had lived in the village from birth until age 7. His grandmother had to fight tooth and nail to take him from his parents, so the child could start first grade. The nearest rural school was several dozen miles from their village. Schools in neighboring settlements had closed at the beginning of the century. His parents protested, declaring that their son should live with them and continue their work. But grandmother emerged victorious from that battle. Threats to report to child services about neglect of parental duties convinced the father and mother of the necessity of their child receiving a school education. Throughout almost his entire education, Michael was forced to visit his parents only during holidays. Several times they tried to keep him there, not allowing him to return to the city, but grandmother quickly resolved the problem. In high school, the young man decided to completely cut off communication with his parents. Their insistence on forcing their son to follow strange, frightening traditions had become too disturbing. The house where their family lived had been passed down to his father from his parents. the only building in the remote village made of weathered gray wood with a tin roof, surrounded by a tall wooden fence with sharp posts along the top edge. It stood in the middle of a clearing on the forest's edge. Other residents' homes were low wooden structures, with additions in the form of animal pens and barns. Flimsy fences made of rotting boards had fallen into the grass in places, but locals didn't care since cars couldn't reach here. So village residents either walked to neighboring settlements or rode in horse-drawn wagons. Michael was partly surprised, partly pleased by the fact that people still lived in the village, despite this place being the most remote inhabited point from the road, and all previous settlements had long been abandoned to nature's will. During his childhood, few people remained here. From dense thickets peeked about 15 abandoned houses. However, at that time, none of the residents sought to leave this place. Everyone was content with quiet existence near the peaceful forest. The village seemed unchanged from Michael's last visit to his parents about 10 years ago. The same households lived as before. The hunched neighbor, who looked to be at least 100 years old, weakly waved her hand and greeted him. The man nodded in response. After several attempts, he found the right key to the gate, slowly moving his feet, delaying the moment of returning to the house. He climbed the stone steps strewn with dry grass and leaves. The front door opened completely silently. Inside, it smelled of dampness and decay. He had to open all the windows wide. His parents had died several months ago. Both died at night from heart failure, and they were found only after a week. During that time, the smell of decomposing bodies had soaked into the wallpaper and furniture. Neighbors had handled the funeral. Michael learned about what happened only a couple of weeks ago when he found a letter from his parents' lawyer in his mailbox. They had bequeathed to their only son the house and a thin notebook with rules for caring for the property, rooms, attic, and things left inside. He set the notebook aside. These rules had been drilled into his head by his parents in childhood. The list was small. Following each point wasn't particularly difficult. However, no matter how hard Michael tried, he couldn't understand the meaning of their existence or purpose. To every question, his parents answered, "Either you'll understand in time, or we'll tell you when you're older." If the boy refused to follow the prescriptions or perform necessary actions without proper enthusiasm, they punished him. They might lock him in the basement, where mice often came for snacks, or in the barn with walls covered in dense spider webs. Spiders didn't just frighten, but terrified Michael, especially the fat cross spiders living near the ceiling beams and in dark corners, unafraid to descend on thin threads directly toward the face of a child calling for help. Michael shuddered. There had been many such dark moments. He didn't justify his parents with any special upbringing methods, but was simply afraid as a child. In his teenage years, he could already somewhat stand up for himself. He didn't want to remember his unhappy childhood, but still wanted to know why his parents followed these rules, why he had been forced to endure such treatment from loved ones. Maybe they had finally bothered to write at least some explanation. He opened the notebook and looked at the list. Never open the locked room under any circumstances, no matter what happens behind the door. Never go down to the basement between 2 and 3 o'clock at night. Never go up to the attic between 3 and 4 o'clock at night. Never feed animals coming from the forest. Never eat during rain. Never take water from the well. Never leave bird nests under the barn roof. Never store the axe outside the house or barn. Never respond if someone knocks on the window at any time of day or night. Never answer the phone if it rings at noon. Just prohibitions, Michael sighed, turning the page. The remaining sheets in the notebook were filled with his mother's small handwriting. There was nothing useful there, only notes about caring for seedlings, the garden, and greenhouse. Well, the mystery of the appearance and necessity of following these frightening rules would obviously remain forever unsolved. He rummaged through his memories. His parents' anger, their panicked fear of breaking even one prohibition. He couldn't remember a single time when even one sound came from behind the doors of the eternally locked room. He didn't remember wild animals emerging from the forest, neighbors offering food or knocking on windows, and the need to go down to the basement or climb to the attic at night seemed never to have arisen at all. The well in the corner of the property had always been covered with a heavy stone lid that even a strong adult man couldn't move. The phone did ring, but remembering the exact time after so many years was no longer possible. My parents were simply crazy, he thought. They made up strange, abnormal restrictions themselves, trembled over following idiotic rules themselves. They also demanded that their son strictly follow them. With their paranoia, they never once left the village, except occasionally going not far into the forest for mushrooms. It was lucky that grandmother turned out to be adequate and didn't allow them to impose crazy fanaticism on her grandson. It's scary to imagine what would have become of Michael now if he had stayed with his parents and followed in their footsteps. He grew up as a normal person, not living by meaningless rituals or obsessive ideas. In childhood and adolescence, he didn't care about these rules, and now he certainly wasn't going to follow them. With this thought, Michael decided to first tidy up the house, and then open the locked room. He couldn't wait to find out what was hidden behind the door, painted with cracked white paint. The door to the special room was locked. Michael hoped to find the key during cleaning. There was a lot of work ahead. He carefully wiped dust, washed windows and floors, rinsed and arranged dishes in cabinets, tidied the parents' bedroom, and sorted clothes and blankets into wardrobes. He didn't notice how the sun disk rolled beyond the horizon in cool twilight, enveloped everything around. He prepared dinner. The house had some supplies of canned goods, cereals, pasta, flour, and vegetable oil. In the freezer lay a chicken, ground beef, and several sausages. After dinner, he had no strength left for anything. He postponed remaining tasks until the next day and went to bed. He couldn't fall asleep for a long time, tossing from side to side. Just as his thoughts dissolved into the haze of long-awaited sleep, rustling of wings came from above, accompanied by an unpleasant squeaking sound. Reluctantly, the man sat up. The blanket fell to the floor. He rubbed his eyes and listened. Someone was definitely rummaging around in the attic, probably some small bird that had crawled through a hole under the roof and found itself trapped. Interesting when it had managed to get there, since during the day it was completely inaudible. Must be that during the cleaning commotion, he hadn't paid attention. The rummaging became louder, the squeaking irritating. Taking a mop, Michael knocked on the ceiling, hoping the frightened bird would quiet down like an impudent upstairs neighbor's child who rides roller skates from morning to evening when parents are absent. His hopes weren't fulfilled. The sounds from the attic didn't subside but intensified. Now the man understood there wasn't just one bird up there, but at least a dozen. Maybe there's a hole in the roof, Michael thought tiredly, shuffling to the hallway for a flashlight. He absolutely didn't want to climb up there in the middle of the night. But if he didn't do it now, he wouldn't be able to close his eyes until morning. He threw on his father's old jacket and changed into worn sneakers. The attic had never been particularly clean. Now there must be real carpets of dust and heavy garlands of spider webs up there. The wooden ladder creaked unpleasantly. The attic hatch yielded surprisingly easily. As soon as he opened it, all sounds immediately stopped. Michael climbed to the last step and shone the flashlight into the darkness. As expected, only dust and cobwebs, no trace of living creatures. He illuminated every corner, beam on the ceiling, nobody. Before he could ask himself what had been making noise under the roof, invisible, unwelcome guests in the darkness began rustling and squeaking again. The darkness under the ceiling flashed with dozens of pairs of small red eyes. Michael exclaimed in surprise. His hand trembled, the flashlight fell from his sweaty palm, rolled a bit across the dry boards, directing a beam of white light straight into the heart of what seemed to appear from nowhere. A tightly clustered crowd of bats that instantly filled the space with deafening screeching. One creature separated from the writhing living lump of wings and fur-covered bodies on the beams and rushed down, aiming directly at the stunned homeowner's face. Michael managed to wave it away at the last moment. The bat that hit the chimney fell to the floor, quietly wheezing. Those watching their comrades failed attack, as if on command, left their shelter and rushed in a whirlwind at the offender. The man couldn't close the attic hatch in time. A flock of enraged small bloodsuckers circled around him. Tiny claws left narrow scratches on his skin. Each bat tried to sink its teeth into his neck or nose to scratch out his eyes. Cursing, Michael tried to descend but missed. His foot slipped on the step, then a brief flight, a wave of wild pain accompanied by numbness in all limbs. For a couple of seconds, he lost hearing, sight, awareness of where he was and what was happening around him. Several particularly agile creatures had enough time to sink their thin teeth into the stunned victim. He came to slowly. His body obeyed poorly. He crawled on all fours to the corridor doors, abandoning attempts to disperse the hungry creatures, only covering his face with his jacket, afraid of losing his eyes. At the threshold, he easily stood up along the wall and opened the door. As quickly as his muscles stiff with aching pain allowed, he stepped into rooms free of bloodthirsty mammals and slammed the door. Several bats had penetrated after him, clinging to his clothes, but he managed to deal with them quickly. He spent the rest of the night in the hallway, spreading old jackets on the floor. Fatigue and pain allowed him to fall asleep. Even the sounds of bats coming from behind the door didn't prevent him from falling into an anxious sleep. Waking up was painful. Sitting on his improvised bed that looked like a hastily made nest, Michael examined himself. No fractures, judging by the sensations. No concussion either. The bump on his head ached but was bearable. He put his ear to the door. Silence. Apparently, the nasty creatures had returned to wait out the day in the attic, or settled in the kitchen. He cracked the door open and looked around. Nobody. Driven by anger, the man decided once and for all to rid the dwelling of uninvited residents. He put on gloves, dug up an old beekeeping protective mask from the depths of a closet. He couldn't think of anything better, and for lack of a better option, at least some protection was better than none. and armed himself with a broom and a dense canvas bag that once stored potatoes and beets. Until he packed all the bats in the bag, every last one, he wouldn't calm down. He walked to the ladder with small steps, as if he wasn't in his own house, but in someone else's where he hadn't been invited. The silence seemed suspicious. Climbing to the attic, he expected a new attack from squeaking creatures. However, nothing happened. There wasn't a single animal in the attic. After thorough searches in every room, Michael never found anyone. He also found no holes in the roof or other passages that animals could have used. Where did they go? The man asked the emptiness, sitting down to rest in the kitchen. A ring from the phone hanging on the wall distracted him from his thoughts. Interesting, who could this be? Probably neighbors. Nobody else knows where he is now or what number to call. He picked up the receiver. Finally, you're back. Michael froze in bewilderment, staring at the phone receiver. A cheerful child's voice wasn't what he expected to hear, since as far as he knew, there were no children in the village. Who are you? I also live in this house, but you never saw me. But I watched you, saw how you grew up, and then you left. Words froze on the man's tongue. He didn't know what to answer. The caller seemed not to notice his silence. Now you'll be looking after this house. Who are you, by the way? And are you really going to follow the rules? I remember how as a child you argued with your parents, always trying to break something just to spite them. Why should these rules be followed at all? Where did they come from? Can you tell me? I can, but I won't. Agree, it's much more interesting to figure everything out yourself. I have to go. Short beeps. The conversation was over. Michael looked at the wall clock. Noon. The list of rules immediately appeared before his mind's eye. Never answer calls at a certain time. The attic was also mentioned there, but at that moment, the man couldn't remember exactly what hour he had climbed up there. If the rules really work, then apparently it was in the interval between 3 and 4 o'clock. So the rules weren't the ravings of madmen, but truly important warnings. Michael didn't intend to think about this. He had a snack, packed a bag, locked the house, and hurried to leave the village. If mysticism exists, let it stay here. He wouldn't participate in this. The neighbor saw him off with a surprised look. The man didn't even bother to say goodbye glumly. If you need anything from the store, leave a list with the Andersons. When they go to town, they'll bring it. I'm leaving, Michael muttered under his breath. He headed toward the forest with quick steps. In half an hour, the path came to an end, but not the trail he had taken yesterday to come to the village. An invisible, intangible boundary wouldn't let him go further. Michael tried to take a step, but couldn't cross the unseen line. In panic, he wandered along the wall, went deep into the forest first from one side and then the other, hoping to find an exit. He couldn't turn anywhere else. There was only one path from the village. Nothing had changed since yesterday, except for one detail. 2 black stone pillars had appeared. Not even scratches could be found on them. Michael rushed back to the village, went around all the few neighbors, asking about the pillars and invisible barrier. All as one didn't understand him, claiming they had never heard of any pillars, had walked that road all their lives without noticing anything. Returning to the house, the man sat at the kitchen table, thinking what to do next. His gaze caught on the notebook open to the page with rules. An unfounded theory was born in his thoughts, but there was no other. He had broken the rules about the phone and probably the rules about the attic. 2 rules, 2 pillars as well. With trembling fingers, he ran through the list. What if everything was arranged so that when you break rules, pillars appear? And then when there are all 10, an exit from the village opens. If so, then at what moment had he found himself locked up? Maybe his parents had kept this secret, and with their death, everything started anew. Or did the strangeness begin the moment he stepped into the yard? There were too many unknowns. The man paced from corner to corner, building one theory after another. There were only two options: risk breaking the rules and maybe he'd manage to leave the village when the 10th pillar appeared. Or not risk it, follow his parents' will, and stay forever in this wilderness, begging for food from neighbors until the end of his life. He chose the first option. He absolutely didn't want to remain in this godforsaken village with a population of about 15 old people. To start, he decided to check whether pillars really appeared after breaking rules. He brought an axe from the house, threw it on the grass, and sat on the porch, staring at the object. Nothing happened. He decided to try a few more rules. He went into the barn and spotted a couple of nests under the roof that looked more like wasp nests than bird nests. In childhood, his father started every morning by inspecting the barn. If nests were discovered, he gave his son a stick, instructing him how to properly get rid of alien dwellings. Now Michael was even glad he didn't even look at the stick standing in the corner, then approached the well. Over the years, the heavy stone cover had cracked. With a sledgehammer, he smashed it. The fragments sank into water that smelled of swamp. He brought a bucket with a rope, placed it next to the well, then after thinking, poured it on the grass and filled another one. Just in case, you never know how this works. He wanted to open the eternally locked door as well, but didn't find the key. Looking out the window, he discovered the axe had disappeared. Postponing the search for the key, he hurried to leave the village. He was right, 3 more pillars had appeared, 4 along one side of the path, 1 on the other. Only 5 rules remained. Inspired by success, he returned home, climbed the porch, and touched the handle of the front door. A whistle behind him made him turn around. An axe was flying at him. At the last moment, he managed to dodge aside. Not maintaining balance, he fell on a dry bush, scratching his face. The sharpened blade plunged into the door. Breathing heavily, Michael looked around. Not a soul. Who then had tried to kill him? He wrapped the axe in a rag and shoved it under a wardrobe. He had to be careful, endure the inconvenience. He wouldn't let an unknown force kill him. He would get out of here no matter what. The house had changed. The atmosphere had become darker, more oppressive, uncomfortable. Michael felt anxiety just being in the rooms, so he decided to question the neighbors again. As expected, they didn't talk about the rules, pretended not to understand him. However, they noted that since his family had their own customs, he shouldn't deviate from them, because his parents were good, kind people, and wouldn't have complicated their lives unnecessarily. But from the old people's faces and averted gazes, the man understood they clearly knew something. Michael didn't tell them he had already broken half the list and didn't intend to stop. By evening, the grass around the well had turned red. The saturated color looked foreign, wrong. Metallic notes were added to the smell of mud. Nausea rose to his throat. The man decided not to approach the well anymore. He checked the barn. The nests had grown across the entire ceiling like a living creature. They resembled ugly beehives. From inside came rustling and quiet chirping. Michael didn't decide to wait for consequences and left the building, locking the door. A winged creature crashed into the dusty window, little resembling a bird. The man hurried to take shelter in the house. What if these animals attack like a flock of bats at night? Michael tried to break down the locked door. No result. Even the axe didn't help. It turns out nothing would work without the key. He decided to continue searching for it tomorrow. He set the alarm for 2 in the morning. He didn't want to postpone breaking the basement rule. Standing before the tightly constructed cover, Michael was nervous. What awaited him below? A pack of rats or someone worse? Maybe something terrible was hiding there that didn't belong to this world. Nothing could be done. In any case, he'd have to go down. His parents hadn't specified whether he needed to spend at least some time in the basement, so the man decided to stand below for a couple of seconds, and then immediately go back up. He secured the open cover, afraid it would slam shut before he managed to return. Going down, he illuminated the space. A couple of shelves filled with jars of spoiled vegetables. Michael sighed with relief, turned around, and put his foot on the bottom step. Sharp pain pierced his shin, similar to a wasp sting. A thick centipede had sunk into his skin through his pants. The man shook off the insect, but immediately hissed from a new painful bite. The floor stirred. Dozens of centipedes crawled out from under the layer of dust. Insects also hid on walls and ceiling. Michael hurried upstairs, almost falling several times while waving away the disgusting creatures falling on his head and trying to crawl under his clothes. He slammed the basement cover, dealt with centipedes that had managed to hide in the folds of his clothing, and went to sleep. The next few days, nothing happened. Only the red grass slowly spread across the property. Michael waited for an opportunity to break the next rule and searched for the key, still unsuccessfully. Watching the neighbors, he dreamed of returning to the city as soon as possible. How could they sit endlessly in this wilderness? During Michael's stay in the village, the villagers never once went to town. Their entire life was limited to working in the garden and short evening walks along the fence, with conversations with neighbors. In the evening, standing on the porch watching the pink sunset, he heard quiet rustling in an overgrown flower bed. Dense bushes trembled, grass rustled. In childhood, Michael was often frightened with rabies. If you see a wild animal, run immediately, or it will bite you and you'll suffer for a long time. No doctor will help. But now, he was more glad than ever to meet a wild beast. He ran to the kitchen, got the remains of sausage, and threw it into the bushes. Hungry chewing sounds followed. The homeowner watched the shaking branches as if mesmerized. The sounds of greedy feeding stopped. The animal emerged from its shelter. Michael shuddered at the sight of the terrible creature that looked as if a car had run over it several times. Broken ribs protruded from its sides. Saliva mixed with blood dripped from its mouth onto the grass. The beast smelled of decay. The man coughed, suppressing a gag reflex. The animal walked toward the porch, preparing to jump. Suddenly, the barn exploded with a crash. The yard filled with displeased chirping. Ugly birds flew out to freedom. Huge flocks circled over the captured building. The broken animal hissed in their direction and hurried to hide in the bushes. The birds, loudly calling and continuing to circle over the property, approached the house. Michael decided to take shelter inside, hoping their target was still the strange animal. A few more days passed without adventures. The blood-scented grass spread frighteningly fast and was about to reach the porch. Strange birds, fortunately, ignored the house, continuing to build their colony. which now partially protruded from the broken barn window. Toward evening, disgusting animals appeared, remotely resembling foxes, deer, hedgehogs, or wild boars. They wandered around the property, occasionally growling at the homeowner. They all looked terrible. Bones protruded from bald hides. In some, blackening entrails could be seen. The smell from the beasts was unbearable. From behind the locked door came children's crying. The man knocked, asking who was there and what had happened. However, there was no answer. All that remained was to continue searching for the key. From the attic and basement at night came rustling and gurgling. Michael got used to the sounds and stopped paying attention. One day at noon, the phone rang again. Michael hesitated whether to answer, since this prohibition had already been broken. Still, he decided to respond. Maybe he'd get a hint. The voice belonged to the same child. "You're not really hurrying," the caller said offendedly. "I'm trying. The key is nowhere to be found. Maybe it's not in the house at all. I'm forbidden to say exactly where. I can only say it's very close. Your parents were clever. They stuffed it in such a place where you wouldn't think to look. Who are you? Why are you locked in the room? Why didn't I hear anything in childhood? I decided it was better to wait, not show myself to you. Your mother and father hoped, believed you would return and continue their work. Understand why under no circumstances should dozens of incomprehensible prohibitions be broken. But they were wrong." "Wasn't I wrong?" the man thought tiredly, sighing heavily. "Only 3 rules left. I'll be eagerly waiting for your further actions. Why is it important to you that they be broken?" "That's a secret," the child laughed melodiously. "I have to go." The conversation alarmed Michael. He decided to throw anxious thoughts out of his head. If he doubted everything, he'd become the same crazy paranoid as his parents. The neighbors looked unkindly at Michael. He carefully found out that they noticed nothing strange on his property, but an unpleasant premonition gnawed at them. The man was afraid that if they learned about his actions, they would prevent him from breaking the remaining 3 rules, thereby closing his path to salvation. At night, someone knocked on the window. Previously, Michael would have been furious, not hesitating to express everything he thought about the unexpected, unwelcome guest and where he should go. But he met this stranger almost with a smile on his face. "Help me," wheezed a hunched old man leaning on a thick stick. "What do you need?" "I'm thirsty," the stranger coughed. "I'll bring water now. Come to the porch." Michael poured a glass of water, threw on a jacket, and put a pocket knife in his pocket. The visiting old man looked ordinary, unkempt, like half the village. Taught by bitter experience, the man understood that the night guest might turn out to be not a harmless old man at all, but a very dangerous creature waiting for an opportunity to attack. Michael wasn't wrong in his assumptions. The stranger stood before the porch, staring directly at the homeowner. "Thank you, you helped an old man," the stranger smiled, reaching forward and placing his foot on the first step. As soon as the night visitor's fingers touched the cold glass, Michael jumped back to the door, gripping the knife in his pocket. The glass shattered on the steps. The old man's eyes flashed red. His worn, greasy jacket fell from his shoulders, revealing a pale torso with protruding ribs and a crooked seam stretching from neck to navel. "How careless of you," he sighed with feigned sadness, licking his lips. Michael noticed ugly beasts emerging from the bushes. A pair of bird-like creatures flew out of the barn window. The man locked himself in the house, listening to the nightmare unfolding outside. He heard the crunch of bones, hungry howling and growling. Someone quickly ran up the steps. The front door shuddered from a strong blow. A jagged crack like lightning appeared in the center. From the next blow, the door flew off its hinges. Michael backed away. A spider-like creature stepped into the hallway, a mixture of thin, bony human legs ending in split feet. A head with thin strands of gray hair swayed from side to side. Arms had lengthened, thin fingers ending in sharp claws. Ribs had spread apart and stretched, scraping the walls. What Michael had initially taken for a seam turned out to be a vertical toothy maw. The previous tenants didn't even say a word to me in all these years. It grinned, slowly moving its legs. Michael rushed to the kitchen, from there to the room, barricading each door behind him. The barricades of nightstands didn't hold long. In a couple of minutes, the 8-legged monster stood before him, gripping his shoulders with its claws. His shirt stuck to his body, wounds pulsed. The stinking maw approached his head. Michael closed his eyes, deciding it was all over. The house shuddered. From the sealed room came a deafening, angry howl. The creature immediately released its victim. Michael covered his ears with his palms. His eardrums hurt. It seemed just a little more, and his head would simply burst. The spider-like thing retreated, staring fearfully at the door. From outside came the whimpering of frightened animals. Coming to his senses, the man sat huddled in the corner for a long time. The child locked in the room had just saved him. Michael knocked on the door, no answer followed. In a whisper, he thanked his unexpected savior. Only at dawn did he dare to go out on the porch. Now there was no door in the house, but it didn't matter. He'd somehow hold out for a couple of days. After cleaning up, he went to sleep. He woke to tapping on the metal awning. Judging by the sound, the rain was ending. He rushed to the kitchen and hastily prepared a stale sandwich. Never had dry bread and old cheese seemed so tasty and appetizing. One rule remained, one step to freedom. With new strength, he got up to search for the key. He examined every inch of the house, remembered the child's words. The key was hidden where you wouldn't think to look. Walking back and forth, he wondered where else he hadn't looked. Without noticing, getting distracted from his thoughts and completely switching attention to the sounds of his own steps. In one place the sound was duller, right in front of the door to the locked room. He tapped this spot with his finger. Below was clearly empty. He brought the axe. With several blows he broke the boards. In a small recess lay a metal box. The lid had rusted. He had to pry it with the axe blade. Inside was a gray key. Not believing his luck, Michael firmly gripped the long-awaited find with trembling fingers. The house shuddered again. Behind the door, palms beat on the floor. "Hurry up, what are you waiting for?" New sprouts of doubt broke through his soul. Was he doing the right thing? Had he already made a serious mistake? Could it be corrected? "I'm tired of sitting here. Let me out," the child whined. Michael remembered his apartment. Quiet evening streets of the city, his favorite cafe where he often went after work, friends and colleagues. He wasn't ready to trade this for rotting in the village. Gripping the key until his palm hurt, he got up and approached the door. Click, the handle smoothly lowered. Old hinges squeaked unpleasantly. The door slowly opened. Inside, the room was empty. Michael wiped drops of cold sweat from his forehead and uncertainly stepped over the threshold. White wallpaper with a faded floral pattern was covered with occult symbols. Black paint had faded with time. Behind a hung black thick curtain was a small window opposite the doorway. The wooden floor was freshly painted red. The man shuddered at the realization of how absurd this detail was. No one had been in the room for at least a couple of decades. Where would fresh paint come from? A sharp metallic smell hit his nostrils. That's how the scarlet grass smelled of blood. The walls began to tremble. It shook not only the house. Judging by screams from the street, the earthquake affected the entire village. Michael fell. His palms were stained red. The setting was changing. Walls blackened, the floor melted and sank down, drawing in like swamp mire. The man jumped up and ran to the exit, not daring to look back at the cursed room. The floor had collapsed, revealing a huge iron cage. The yard was unrecognizable, bloody grass everywhere. Mutilated animals raced around the area, attacking screaming neighbors. In the sky circled flocks of predatory birds, constantly descending to competitors to snatch prey. Behind the fence stood the spider-like creature, greedily rubbing its paws. Other creatures crowded near it, remotely resembling people of varying degrees of ugliness. Michael rushed away. To hell with the others. He couldn't help them anyway. Now the main thing was to escape this nightmare and return home to the city. "What have you done?" screamed the hunched old woman, desperately trying to fight off a hungry flock of shrieking birds. "Why did you open the door? What did we do to deserve this?" The man turned away and ran with all his might along the path. He would rethink his actions later in a safe place. 10 stone pillars, 5 on each side, rose in clouds of thick fog. Even here, desperate cries of local residents, roaring, cawing, and howling could be heard. His body trembled finely with excitement and nausea. From the fog came a tall figure toward him. The one standing opposite was dressed in a cloak woven from black moss. Long gray hair fell untidily on his shoulders. Several thin, curved horns protruded in different directions. Michael froze in place, staring in horror at the stranger. He felt that the one who emerged from the fog was dangerous. "Who are you, the one you helped?" the figure said in a child's voice. "Why is this happening?" "I'll show you," he pronounced differently now, his voice breaking into a whole chorus of low voices. In an instant, he appeared before the deathly pale man and placed his hand on his head. Michael didn't even have time to cry out. In his mind swirled pictures of a terrible past. Through the creature's eyes, he saw the forest where it had lived many centuries ago. People brought him offerings, and he granted them prosperity. Once, several strangers settled in the village. With them, they brought another being that brought people not prosperity but sorrow. The strangers didn't understand whom the locals secretly worshipped. This led to crop failure, livestock death, and disease. The other creature consumed those who summoned it and left these places, while he, a deity who had lived here much longer, could do little to help the residents. Too great was the damage done through ignorance. People decided he was the culprit of their misfortunes. Through deception, they lured him into a trap and locked him up, bound him with ridiculous prohibitions. For long years, they guarded him, not allowing him to break free. They chose each century a new family that would have to guard him. No matter how the forest lord tried, he couldn't gain freedom. His strength was only enough to forever lock his jailers in the village. Only one who voluntarily wanted to free him could help. The creature, embittered against ungrateful people, waited for the moment when it could break free and take revenge on the descendants of the villagers who had imprisoned it. Everything stopped abruptly. Michael breathed heavily, not taking his eyes off the ancient creature. "You helped me, go." A skeletal finger pointed at the path. Michael didn't need to be convinced. He ran forward, afraid to turn around, afraid that the creature freed from captivity would change its mind. He didn't stop until he reached the paved road. Catching his breath, he trudged along the highway, not believing his luck. An elderly couple picked him up, heading to the same city where he lived. He decided not to think about what had happened. He just wanted to live like every person on the planet. What happened couldn't be changed. The forest flashed past in a colorful strip. Michael watched black flocks circling over the ancient trees. I don't even know if the main character really did the right thing by freeing this creature, which seemed to be good, but still took revenge on the village residents who had treated it so badly. I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I did, and you'll put an emoji or phone smiley. That's how we'll know how many of us listened to the story to the very end. And as always, I'm not saying goodbye to you, because we'll hear each other again in the next terrifyingly interesting story. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.